The harbor at Dieppe smelled of salt, rotting fish, and the desperate hope of people with nowhere else to go. Marguerite Vallon stood on the dock in the gray morning of May 1684, clutching a small wooden chest that contained everything she owned: 2 dresses, a Bible, her mother's silver cross, and letters from a man she had never met. Around her, 42 other young women gathered in nervous clusters, all filles du roi, king's daughters, chosen to sail to New France and marry colonists who needed wives. Most were like Marguerite, orphans or daughters of impoverished families, girls with no prospects in France who had chosen uncertainty across an ocean over certain poverty at home. Mademoiselle Vallon? Sister Anne-Marie, the nun overseeing their departure, consulted her registry. "You're matched with Monsieur Henri Dupuis of Quebec?" "Yes, sister." "A good match. Monsieur Dupuis is 35, a carpenter with his own shop and property. He's been in the colony 8 years and has established himself well." The nun's smile was meant to be encouraging. "You're fortunate." Marguerite nodded, though fortune felt like a strange word for her circumstances. At 17, she was being sent across an ocean to marry a man more than twice her age, a stranger whose only knowledge of her came from a brief letter and the assurances of colonial officials that she was of good character and sufficient health. But what choice did she have? Her parents were dead, victims of fever that had swept through Dieppe 2 years ago. She had survived by working in her uncle's tavern, enduring his wandering hands and her aunt's bitter accusations that she encouraged them. When the Crown's recruitment officer had appeared, seeking young women for the colonial bride program, Marguerite had signed her name without hesitation. New France might be harsh and unknown, but it couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. "The San Francois departs with the tide," Sister Anne-Marie announced to the assembled women. "Board now, and may God grant you safe passage and fruitful marriages in the new world." The ship was a merchant vessel of perhaps 300 tons, laden with supplies for the colony. The women's quarters occupied the lower deck, cramped, dim, and already rank with the smell of too many bodies in too little space. Marguerite found a hammock near a small porthole that at least offered some light and air. "First time at sea?" asked the girl in the next hammock, a red-haired woman of perhaps 20, with the practical air of someone accustomed to hardship. "Yes. You?" "Third time. I'm Lisette Moreau. I was supposed to sail last year, but I got sick and missed the ship. Then the ship I was on this spring turned back because of storms. 3rd time's the charm, they say. Though at this rate I'll be an old woman before I reach New France." "What made you sign up?" "Same as everyone else, I imagine. No future in France. My parents died, my brothers took the farm, and I was left with nothing. The Crown offers 50 livres dowry to women who marry in New France, plus passage paid. That's more than I'd ever see otherwise." Lisette studied Marguerite curiously. "You're matched already?" "Yes, a carpenter named Henri Dupuis." "You're lucky. Some of us arrive unmatched and have to choose from whoever's available. I've heard stories, desperate men, some of them, farmers who've been in the wilderness so long they've forgotten how to be civilized, soldiers who drink too much and beat their wives." Lisette's expression grew more serious. "But there are good men, too, supposedly, men who genuinely want partners, not just unpaid servants." "Which kind is Henri Dupuis?" Marguerite wondered aloud. "I suppose you'll find out." The San Francois sailed with the afternoon tide, and Marguerite watched through the porthole as France receded, the familiar coastline, the only home she'd ever known, disappearing into gray distance. She felt no grief at the departure, only a strange numbness. Her life in Dieppe had ended the day her parents died. This was simply the next chapter, whatever it might bring. The crossing proved as miserable as everyone had warned. The ship pitched and rolled constantly, and Marguerite was violently seasick for the first 2 weeks. The women's quarters became fetid with the smell of vomit and unwashed bodies. Food was monotonous: ship's biscuit crawling with weevils, dried peas, occasional salt pork. Water grew stale and brackish. But worse than physical discomfort was the boredom. Day after day of nothing but gray ocean and gray sky, cramped quarters, and the same 42 faces. Marguerite spent hours reading Henri's letters, trying to glean his character from carefully composed words. He wrote formally, as if addressing a business associate rather than a future wife. Mademoiselle Vallon, I am pleased to learn you will be my bride. I am a carpenter of some skill, with a shop on Rue Saint-Jean in Quebec's upper town. I own my property outright and have steady work from both military and civilian clients. I seek a wife who can manage a household competently, who is of good moral character, and who understands that life in New France requires hard work and resilience. If you possess these qualities, we shall deal well together. I look forward to meeting you upon your arrival. Henri Dupuis. Not exactly romantic, but practical. Perhaps that was better than false promises of affection. Marguerite had no illusions about love. This was a business arrangement, a transaction where she provided domestic labor and childbearing in exchange for security and status as a married woman. If Henri was decent and didn't beat her, she would count herself fortunate. The San Francois encountered storms in the 3rd week, massive waves that tossed the ship like driftwood, winds that screamed through the rigging. For 2 terrifying days, they thought they might sink. Several women prayed constantly, others simply lay in their hammocks, too frightened to move. Marguerite found herself strangely calm. If they sank, at least death would be quick. Better than slowly starving or being trapped in an abusive marriage. She had made her choice when she boarded this ship. Now she would accept whatever consequences followed. The storm passed, leaving them battered but afloat. One woman had died during the worst of it, a girl barely 16 who had been weak with fever even before boarding. They committed her body to the sea with prayers, and that night several women wept in their hammocks. Marguerite didn't weep. She had cried out all her tears when her parents died. Now she simply existed, moving forward because there was no other direction available. On the 73rd day at sea, someone cried, "Land!" Marguerite pressed her face to the porthole and saw a rocky coastline emerging from morning mist. New France, the edge of an unknown world that would be her home for whatever remained of her life. The San Francois sailed up the St. Lawrence River, the shores revealing themselves as densely forested and wild. Cleared settlements appeared occasionally, small clusters of wooden buildings where habitants had carved farms from the wilderness. It looked harsh, primitive, nothing like the established towns and villages of France. This was where she would live now, where she would marry, bear children, grow old, or die young. There was no returning to France, no changing her mind. She was committed as surely as if she'd taken religious vows. Quebec appeared around a bend in the river, a settlement perched on a cliff above the water, dominated by stone fortifications and a large church. It was far smaller than Marguerite had imagined, perhaps 1,000 souls, but it had an air of permanence that the other settlements lacked. The ship docked on a July afternoon, and the Filles Du Roi prepared to disembark. Sister Anne-Marie gathered them for final instructions. For those of you already matched, your fiancés should be waiting on the dock. You'll be taken to lodgings and married within the week. The colonial authorities prefer quick marriages to avoid impropriety. For those unmatched, the sisters of the congregation will house you while you meet potential husbands. Remember, you must marry within the year or return to France. Choose wisely, but don't delay unnecessarily. Marguerite descended the gangplank with her small chest, scanning the crowd gathered on the dock. Somewhere among these men was Henri Dupuis, her intended husband. Would she recognize him from his description? Would he be disappointed when he saw her, too thin, too plain, too young? A woman in the gray habit of the congregation of Notre Dame approached with a ledger. "What is your name?" "Marguerite Vallon. I'm to marry Henri Dupuis." The nun's expression changed, surprise, then something like pity. "Come with me, please." Marguerite felt cold dread settle in her stomach as she followed the nun away from the dock, through narrow streets to a stone building that served as the congregation's headquarters. Inside, an older nun, perhaps 50, with kind but weary eyes, waited in a small office. "Sit down, my child," the older nun said gently. "I'm Sister Marguerite Bourgeois. I'm afraid I have difficult news regarding Monsieur Dupuis." "He's changed his mind?" Marguerite asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He doesn't want to marry me?" "No, child, I'm sorry to tell you this. Henri Dupuis is dead. He died 3 weeks ago, killed in an Iroquois raid on a farm settlement outside Quebec." The words took a moment to register. Dead? Her fiancé, the man she had crossed an ocean to marry, whose letters she had read dozens of times, whose household she was supposed to manage, was dead. "What happens to me now?" Marguerite heard herself ask, her voice distant, as if someone else were speaking. "You'll stay with the congregation while we arrange another match. Quebec has many men seeking wives. You're young, healthy, clearly capable. You'll have no trouble finding a suitable husband." "How long will that take?" "Weeks, perhaps. The colonial authorities prefer Filles Du Roi marry quickly, but we'll ensure you have time to choose wisely. Unless," Sister Marguerite hesitated, "unless you wish to return to France. The Saint Francois departs in 2 weeks. If you choose to return, passage would be provided." Return to France? To her uncle's tavern, his groping hands, her aunt's accusations, to poverty and no prospects, to everything she had fled. "No," Marguerite said firmly. "I came to New France to marry and build a life. Henri Dupuis is dead, but the colony still needs women. I'll find another husband." Sister Marguerite's expression softened with something like respect. "You're a brave girl. Very well. We'll house you with the other unmatched women, and I'll begin introducing you to suitable men. Meanwhile, you should know, Monsieur Dupuis left property, a shop, a house, some savings. His will specified that if he died before marrying, his property would go to his brother in Montreal, but if he died after marrying," she trailed off meaningfully, "after marrying, it would go to his widow. But we never married, so I have no claim." "Exactly. I mention it only so you understand what you've lost. Dupuis's property was substantial. You would have been quite comfortable as his widow." Marguerite absorbed this information. She had been destined for relative prosperity, security, a well-established household. Now she would be starting over with nothing, choosing from whatever men were available, with no guarantee of finding anyone as well situated as Henri Dupuis had been. But she was alive. She was in New France, away from her uncle's predatory attention. She had opportunity, even if it was more uncertain than she had planned. "When do I start meeting potential husbands?" "As soon as you are ready. Tomorrow, if you wish. There are several men who've expressed interest in marrying one of this year's arrivals." "Then tomorrow. I didn't cross an ocean to waste time." That night, lying in a narrow bed in the congregation's dormitory, Marguerite thought about Henri Dupuis. She had never met him, had barely begun to imagine their life together, yet his death had upended everything, transformed her from intended bride of a prosperous craftsman to just another unmatched fille du roi hoping to find a decent husband. She wondered how he had died. Quickly, she hoped, without too much pain or fear. She wondered what kind of man he had been beyond his formal letters. She wondered if anyone mourned him, or if he had died alone and unmissed except as the loss of a potential marriage contract. But mostly, she wondered what tomorrow would bring, what men she would meet, what choices she would face, what future awaited in this harsh, beautiful, terrifying new world. Sister Marguerite introduced Marguerite to her first potential husband the next afternoon, an habitant named Jacques Leblanc, who owned a farm 15 miles upriver from Quebec. He was perhaps 40, weathered and muscular from hard labor, with gaps in his teeth and the rough manners of someone who had spent years in the wilderness. "You're young," he observed, studying Marguerite as he might examine livestock. "Can you work? Farm work is hard. Planting, harvesting, tending animals. I need a wife who won't collapse after a few hours." "I've worked since I was old enough to hold a broom," Marguerite replied evenly. "I'm stronger than I look." "You'd need to be. The farm is isolated. Nearest neighbors are 3 miles away. Long winters with nothing but snow and each other. Some women go mad from it. Think you can handle that?" Marguerite thought of her cramped hammock on the Saint Francois, of endless gray ocean and nothing but the same faces for weeks. "I can handle isolation." Leblanc nodded slowly. "I had a wife. She died birthing our 3rd child 2 years ago. The children are with my sister in Montreal now, but I want them back. I need a mother for them, someone to manage the household while I work the land. If you marry me, that would be your role. Mother, housekeeper, farmhand when needed. Understand?" "I understand." "I'm not a gentleman," Leblanc continued bluntly. "Life out there doesn't allow for gentleness. But I don't beat women, and I pay my debts. You'd be fed, clothed, housed. That's what I can offer." It was honest, at least. No false promises of affection or easy living. Just hard work, isolation, and basic security. "May I have time to consider?" Marguerite asked. "I'm meeting with 2 other girls this week. First one who agrees to marry me, I'll wed immediately. Don't wait too long to decide." After Leblanc left, Sister Marguerite asked, "What do you think?" "He's honest about what he offers," Marguerite replied carefully. "But 15 miles from Quebec, winters alone with 3 children who aren't mine, endless farm work. Sister, is there anyone else?" The second potential husband was an older man named Claude Beaumont, a widower of perhaps 55, who worked as a clerk for the colonial administration. He was educated, well-dressed, and spoke with the refined accent of someone who had been born to better circumstances than most colonists. "I'm too old to work physical labor anymore," he explained over tea in the congregation's parlor. "I need a wife who can manage my household, cooking, cleaning, perhaps some sewing. In exchange, I offer a comfortable home in Quebec's upper town, steady income, respectability. I don't expect, well, marital intimacy beyond what's necessary to fulfill Christian duty. I need a housekeeper more than a wife, truly." "Why not simply hire a housekeeper?" "Because a wife has legal obligations a hired servant doesn't. She can't leave on a whim, can't demand higher wages, can't shirk duties when convenient." Beaumont's smile was thin. "I apologize for the bluntness, but I believe in clarity. You would have a comfortable life, but it would be a business arrangement, nothing more." At least he was honest, but the thought of managing the household of a man old enough to be her grandfather, of fulfilling Christian duty with someone she could never feel anything for, made her skin crawl. "I need time to consider," she said again. Over the next week, Marguerite met 5 more potential husbands: a soldier from the garrison who reeked of wine even in mid-afternoon, a young blacksmith who seemed kind but admitted he could barely feed himself, let alone a wife, a merchant who expected her to work in his shop while also managing his home and bearing children immediately, an older farmer whose farm had been raided 3 times by Iroquois and whose first wife had been killed in one such raid. None of them felt right. All of them represented hard lives with uncertain futures and men she felt no connection to. "You're too particular," Lisette Moreau observed one evening in the dormitory. Lisette had already accepted a proposal from a young habitant named Pierre Morin and would marry within the week. "You can't expect love or even compatibility. Choose the one who offers the most security and be done with it." "Is that what you did?" "Pierre seems kind, and his farm is only 5 miles from Quebec, so I won't be completely isolated. That's as much as I can hope for. You should accept Beaumont. At least you'd live comfortably in town rather than breaking your back on some remote farm." Marguerite knew Lisette was right. She was being impractical, holding out for something better when she should be grateful for any offer. But some stubborn part of her refused to settle, refused to accept that her entire future should be determined by choosing the least objectionable option from a handful of desperate or unsuitable men. On her 10th day in Quebec, Sister Marguerite called her to the office with a different expression, something like reluctance mixed with calculation. "I've had an unusual inquiry," the sister began. "There's a soldier from the garrison, Sergeant Luc Fontaine. He's asked to meet you specifically." "Why specifically? He doesn't know me." "He saw you on the dock when the Saint Francois arrived. He asked about you, learned your intended had died, and requested an introduction." Sister Marguerite's tone suggested disapproval. "I should tell you, Sergeant Fontaine has something of a reputation. He's capable, respected by his men, but he's also known for independence of thought. He questions orders sometimes, speaks his mind when discretion would serve better. That's not necessarily a bad quality, but it makes him somewhat unpredictable." "Is he looking for a wife?" "He says so, though he's never expressed interest before, despite being in the colony 3 years, which makes me wonder why he's suddenly eager to meet you." The sister paused. "I can refuse his request if you prefer. You have no obligation to meet every man who expresses interest." Marguerite thought of the suitors she'd already met: the rough farmer, the ancient clerk, the drunken soldier, the desperate blacksmith. What harm could one more meeting do? "I'll meet him," she decided. Sergeant Luc Fontaine appeared at the congregation house the next afternoon in his military uniform, which somehow made him seem more formal and less threatening than the rough clothes most suitors wore. He was perhaps 28, of medium height and solid build, with dark hair and eyes that assessed Marguerite with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate situations quickly. "Mademoiselle Vallon," he said with a slight bow, "thank you for agreeing to meet me. I'm Luc Fontaine, sergeant in the Carignan-Salière regiment, though most of those original troops have returned to France by now." "Why did you stay when others returned?" "Because France holds nothing for me. I'm a soldier's son with no inheritance and no prospects beyond military service. Here, after my term ends, I can claim land and build something of my own. That's worth more than returning to France to compete for diminishing opportunities." They sat in the parlor, while a younger nun chaperoned from a discreet distance. Luc studied Marguerite with that same assessing look, and she found herself meeting his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. "Tell me about yourself, beyond what the sisters' registry says. Why did you come to New France?" Marguerite considered lying, presenting herself as the ideal wife material, but something about Luc's direct manner invited honesty. Because I had no choice. My parents died, my relatives didn't want me, and I had no prospects. The crown offered passage and a dowry if I married a colonist. It seemed better than remaining in France with no future. Honest, I appreciate that. Luke leaned back slightly. Let me be equally honest. I'm not wealthy. A sergeant's pay is adequate but not generous. When my term ends in 2 years, I'll receive a land grant, but building a functioning farm takes years of brutal work. If you marry me, life won't be easy or comfortable for a long time. Would we live on a farm or in Quebec? For now, in Quebec, I have quarters in the garrison, though they're cramped. After my term ends, we'd move to wherever my land grant is assigned, likely somewhere between Quebec and Montreal, possibly quite remote. You'd need to be strong, adaptable, willing to work alongside me rather than simply managing a household. And children? Eventually, if God wills it, but I won't demand you bear a child every year until you're worn out. I've seen too many women die in childbirth because their husbands couldn't restrain themselves. Luke's expression was serious. I need a partner, Mademoiselle Vallon, someone who can think for herself, make decisions when I'm away on patrol, handle emergencies without falling apart. If you're looking for an easy life or a wealthy husband, I'm not your man. But if you want a partner who'll respect you and work alongside you to build something lasting, that I can offer. It was the most compelling proposal Marguerite had heard, not because it promised comfort or security, but because it offered genuine partnership. Luke was treating her as an equal, acknowledging her intelligence and capability, offering respect rather than just protection and provision. May I think about it? Of course, but Mademoiselle, Marguerite, understand that my military duties come first. If you marry me, there will be times when I'm away on patrol for weeks, times when you're alone with only other garrison wives for company, times when Iroquois raids make the settlement dangerous. This isn't a safe or predictable life. Nothing in New France seems safe or predictable, Marguerite replied. At least you're honest about what you're offering. After Luke departed, Sister Marguerite asked the inevitable question, "What do you think?" "I think he's different from the others, more thoughtful, more respectful. He's also a soldier with uncertain prospects. Beaumont offers immediate comfort. Leblanc offers an established farm. Fontaine offers only hard work and the promise of land in 2 years. But he offers partnership. None of the others did that." Sister Marguerite studied her with shrewd eyes. "You're drawn to him." "I barely know him." "That's not what I asked. Be careful, child. Making decisions based on attraction rather than practical considerations can lead to regret." But as Marguerite lay in bed that night, reviewing her options, she found herself thinking not about Beaumont's comfortable home or Leblanc's established farm, but about Luc Fontaine's serious eyes and his offer of genuine partnership. Perhaps Sister Marguerite was right that she was being impractical. Perhaps attraction was clouding her judgment. But Marguerite had spent 17 years being practical, accepting whatever life offered, making the best of bad situations. Just once she wanted to choose something, someone, for reasons beyond mere survival. And Luc Fontaine, with his honesty and his respect and his offer of partnership, was the only man who had made her want to say yes. Marguerite made her decision 3 days later, after another meeting with Claude Beaumont, in which he explained in tedious detail the household duties she would be expected to perform as his wife. His precision was suffocating: specific hours for meals, exact methods for cleaning, rigid schedules that left no room for variation or independence. "I need order in my household," Beaumont explained. "My first wife understood this. She ran the home exactly as I specified, and we had 23 years of peaceful coexistence." peaceful coexistence, not happiness, not partnership, just order and predictability and emotional emptiness. "Thank you for your time, Monsieur Beaumont," Marguerite said when he finally finished his litany of expectations. "But I don't believe we would suit each other. I wish you well in finding a wife." Beaumont's expression suggested he thought her foolish, but he accepted her refusal with a stiff nod and departed. Sister Marguerite, who had been monitoring the conversation, raised an eyebrow. "That was your most secure option. You're certain?" "I'd rather break my back on a farm than spend 20 years as Beaumont's housekeeper wife. At least physical exhaustion ends when you sleep. That kind of suffocation never stops." "And Sergeant Fontaine, is that your choice then?" "If he still wants me. Has he asked again?" "He came by yesterday while you were meeting with Beaumont. I told him you were still considering your options. He said he'd wait one more week, then assume your answer was no and stop hoping." Sister Marguerite's expression softened slightly. "You should know, I asked about him. His commanding officer speaks highly of his competence, but confirms what I said about his independence. He questions orders he believes are wrong, advocates for his men even when it risks his superiors' displeasure. That kind of integrity is admirable, but it can also cause problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind where a man ends up posted to the most dangerous assignments because he's inconvenient to have around. The kind where promotions go to more pliable officers. Luc Fontaine will likely never rise above sergeant because he refuses to be silent when he should be." Marguerite considered this. A man who stood by his principles even when it cost him advancement, a man who valued integrity over ambition. These seemed like virtues, not flaws. "Where can I find him?" asked Marguerite. "At the garrison, likely. But Marguerite, think carefully. Once you commit to a marriage, there's no undoing it. If Fontaine turns out to be difficult, or if military life proves too hard, you can't simply change your mind." "I understand, but I've thought carefully, sister. Sergeant Fontaine is the only man who's treated me as a person rather than a solution to a problem. That's worth the risk." The garrison occupied a stone building near the cliff edge, with walls thick enough to withstand attack and narrow windows designed for defense. Marguerite approached the gate nervously, unsure of protocol. A young soldier standing guard looked her up and down with open curiosity. "Can I help you, mademoiselle?" "I'm looking for Sergeant Luc Fontaine. Is he available?" The soldier's expression became more respectful. "I'll fetch him. Wait here." Minutes passed while Marguerite stood in the summer heat, second-guessing her decision. What if Luc had changed his mind? What if he'd met another woman, someone more suitable or more attractive? What if she was making a terrible mistake? Then he appeared, emerging from the garrison in shirt sleeves, his uniform jacket removed in deference to the heat. His expression when he saw her was surprised, then cautiously hopeful. "Marguerite, I didn't expect. Did you want to speak with me?" "Yes. Is there somewhere we can talk privately? Well, as privately as propriety allows." Luc led her to a small courtyard behind the garrison where several benches overlooked the river. They sat, and Marguerite felt her carefully prepared speech evaporate under his steady gaze. "I've considered all my options, the farmer, the clerk, the others, and I've decided," she took a breath, "if your offer still stands, I would like to accept it. I would like to marry you." Luc's expression didn't change immediately, as if he needed time to process her words. Then a slow smile transformed his face, making him look younger and less serious. "You're certain? You understand what you'd be accepting: cramped garrison quarters, long absences, uncertain future?" "I understand, but you offered partnership and respect. None of the others did that. Those things matter more to me than immediate comfort or security." "Then yes," Luke said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, my offer stands. I would be honored if you'd agree to be my wife." They sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of the decision settling over them both. Marguerite had just committed herself to marrying a man she barely knew, to a life she couldn't fully imagine. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "When?" she asked finally. "As soon as the banns can be posted and the paperwork completed. A week, perhaps, 2. Is that acceptable?" "Yes. Though I should warn you, I know very little about being a soldier's wife. I'll need you to be patient while I learn. And I should warn you, I know very little about being a husband. I've been a soldier since I was 16. This will be new territory for both of us." His honesty eased some of Marguerite's anxiety. They would be learning together, neither one expert, both making mistakes. That felt more manageable than trying to meet someone else's established expectations. "Tell me about your duties," Marguerite said. "What does a sergeant do? How often are you away on patrol?" Luke explained the garrison's structure, his responsibilities overseeing a squad of 12 men, the rotation of patrols and guard duties that kept soldiers away from Quebec for days or weeks at a time. He described the tension between French settlers and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois confederation that resented French expansion and occasionally raided isolated settlements. "It's dangerous work," he admitted. "I won't lie about that. Men die on patrol, ambushes, accidents, disease. But we're well trained and well armed. The odds are in our favor most of the time." "Most of the time," Marguerite repeated. "And when they're not? Then you'd become a very young widow with a soldier's pension that won't keep you fed for long. I won't pretend that's not a possibility." Luke met her eyes directly. "If that possibility frightens you too much, you should reconsider. Choose Beaumont or LeBlanc, someone whose survival is more certain." "Everyone's survival is uncertain in New France. At least you're honest about the risks." They talked for another hour, sharing details about their lives, his childhood in Normandy, her years in Dieppe, his experiences in the colonial military, her observations about Quebec society during her brief time in the settlement. Marguerite found herself relaxing, enjoying the conversation, feeling the first stirrings of genuine liking for this serious man who treated her as an equal. When she finally returned to the congregation house, Sister Marguerite took one look at her face and sighed. "You've accepted Sergeant Fontaine." "I have." "Then I'll begin the paperwork. The banns will be posted this Sunday, and if no impediments arise, you can marry in 3 weeks. You'll need a wedding dress. We have simple gowns available for Filles Du Roi who arrive without suitable clothing." "Thank you, Sister." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've experienced a Quebec winter in garrison quarters with a husband away on patrol half the time. Then we'll see if you still think this was a wise choice." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Marguerite attended required sessions with Father Benoit, the Jesuit priest who would perform the ceremony, learning about the sacrament of marriage and her duties as a Christian wife. She met with other garrison wives who offered advice ranging from practical, keep extra firewood stored, the garrison allocation is never enough, to pessimistic, get used to being alone and don't ask too many questions about where he goes or what he does. She saw Luke when his duties allowed, brief meetings always chaperoned by Sister Marguerite or another nun. They talked about practical matters, how they would divide their cramped quarters, what household items they needed, how Marguerite would support herself if Luke's military pay proved insufficient. "I can sew," Marguerite offered. "Perhaps I could take in mending or make simple garments for sale." "That would help. My pay covers rent and basic food, but there's little left for anything else. If you can earn even a few livres monthly, it would make a significant difference." It was unromantic conversation, focused on survival and logistics rather than feelings or affection, but Marguerite found comfort in the practicality. This was real, a genuine partnership where both would contribute, both would work, both would struggle together, rather than one carrying the burden alone. Lisette married her Pierre Morin in a simple ceremony 10 days before Marguerite's planned wedding. Afterward, at the small celebration held in the congregation courtyard, Lisette pulled Marguerite aside. "You're really going through with marrying Fontaine?" "I am. I've heard things about him. He's respected but considered difficult, speaks his mind when he should stay silent, challenges his superiors. That kind of behavior brings trouble, Marguerite. You'll be tied to whatever consequences follow. Or I'll be married to a man who stands by his principles. I can think of worse fates." Lisette shook her head but smiled. "You're braver than I am, or more foolish. I hope it works out for you." The wedding took place on an August morning in the stone church that dominated Quebec's upper town. Marguerite wore a simple gown provided by the congregation, plain gray wool that would be serviceable for daily wear after the ceremony. Luc wore his dress uniform, formal and impressive in the morning light streaming through narrow windows. Father Benoit performed the ceremony in Latin with French translation for the actual vows. Marguerite listened to herself promise to love, honor, and obey Luc Fontaine until death parted them, heard him make reciprocal promises, and felt the weight of commitment settle over her like a cloak. This was irrevocable. For better or worse, she was now Marguerite Fontaine, wife of a soldier, bound to this man and this life. When Luc kissed her, briefly, formally, conscious of watching eyes, Marguerite felt no passion, but she did feel something, safety. Whatever else happened, she was no longer alone. She had a partner now, someone who would stand with her against whatever new France threw at them. The garrison wives had organized a modest celebration: bread, cheese, wine, the best Quebec could offer on short notice. Marguerite met Luc's fellow soldiers, rough men who teased him good-naturedly about finally taking a wife. She met his commanding officer, Captain Moreau, who congratulated them with perfunctory politeness that didn't quite hide his skepticism. "A soldier's wife needs strength and patience, Madame Fontaine," Moreau said. "I hope you possess both in abundance." "I hope so too, Captain." That evening, Luc brought Marguerite to their quarters, a single room in the garrison barracks, perhaps 12 feet square, with a narrow bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace. It was cramped, spare, and utterly utilitarian. "It's not much," Luc admitted, setting down Marguerite's chest. "But it's warm in winter, and we have privacy. That's more than many soldiers have." "It's fine. I've lived in worse." Marguerite looked around their new home, trying to envision making it comfortable. "We'll manage." They stood awkwardly for a moment, both aware that they were alone together for the first time, both uncertain how to proceed. Finally, Luc cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something about tonight, about marital obligations." Marguerite felt her stomach tighten. She knew what happened between husbands and wives, had received terse instruction from Sister Marguerite about her duties. She was prepared to endure it, hoped it wouldn't be too painful or degrading. "I'm aware of what's expected," she said quietly. "What I'm trying to say is, I won't demand anything tonight. You've had a long day, you're exhausted, and we barely know each other. I can wait until you're ready, until we've had time to become comfortable with each other." Marguerite stared at him, surprised. Most men would have considered consummation their right, would have taken what the marriage contract entitled them to, regardless of their wife's readiness. "You're certain?" "I'm certain. We have our entire lives together. There's no need to rush the intimate aspects. When it happens, I want you willing, not just resigned." He gestured to the bed. "You take it tonight. I'll sleep on the floor. Tomorrow we can figure out better arrangements." That night, lying in the narrow bed while Luc slept on the floor with his military cloak as covering, Marguerite felt tears slip down her cheeks. Not from sadness or regret, but from overwhelming relief. She had made the right choice. Luc Fontaine was exactly the kind of man she had hoped he would be. Honorable, patient, genuinely concerned with her comfort and dignity. Whatever hardships lay ahead, and she didn't doubt there would be many, at least she would face them with a partner who respected her. That was more than most Filles Du Roi could say. And for Marguerite Fontaine, formerly Vallon, it was enough. Marguerite's first weeks as a soldier's wife revealed the peculiar isolation of garrison life. She lived among soldiers, but not of them, part of a small community of military wives who occupied an uncertain social space, neither military personnel nor independent civilians, but something in between. The senior garrison wife was Madame Teresa Morel, the captain's wife, a woman of perhaps 40 who had lived in New France for 15 years. She summoned Marguerite for tea 3 days after the wedding, a summons that was more command than invitation. "You're Fontaine's wife," Madame Therese said, studying Marguerite with shrewd eyes over her teacup. They sat in the Moreau's quarters, which were substantially larger and better appointed than the single room Marguerite shared with Luc. "How much has he told you about military life?" "He's been honest about the difficulties, long absences, danger, limited resources." "Has he told you about the other wives, about how we manage when our men are away for weeks at a time?" "No, madame." "Then I'll explain. When the men are on patrol, which is often, we wives must support each other. We share food when someone's stores run low. We help with childcare. We nurse the sick. We defend each other's reputations when gossip starts. This isn't France, where you can maintain private distance from neighbors. Here, we're dependent on each other for survival."
I understand. I hope so. Because Luc Fontaine is complicated. He's an excellent soldier, loyal to his men, but he makes enemies among the officers by questioning orders and advocating for changes in how things are done. That makes life difficult for you as his wife. Some of the other officers' wives will shun you because their husbands don't like your husband. You need to be prepared for that. Marguerite felt defensive anger rise. "My husband has principles that shouldn't be held against me." "Principles don't keep you warm in winter or put food on your table. Remember that." Therese's expression softened slightly. "I'm not saying you made a bad choice. Luc is a good man, but good men can be inconvenient in military structures that value obedience over independent thought. Just be aware that your husband's integrity may cost you in ways you haven't anticipated." The warning proved prescient. Within a week, Marguerite noticed subtle social divisions among the garrison wives. 2 of them, Madame Dupont and Madame Rousseau, whose husbands were lieutenants, maintained polite but distant relationships with her, never quite including her in their conversations or activities. Others, particularly wives of enlisted men, were friendlier, sensing perhaps that Marguerite occupied a similar uncertain position. One of these was Hélène Gagnon, wife of a corporal, a woman of 25 who'd been in the colony 3 years. She appeared at Marguerite's door one morning with a basket of vegetables. "Gift from my husband's garden plot," Hélène explained, "from we have more than we can use." "Thank you. That's very kind." Marguerite invited her in, grateful for friendly company in the cramped quarters. "Can I offer you tea? We don't have much, but—" "Tea is a luxury most of us do without, but I'll sit with you for a few minutes if you'd like company." Over the next hour, Hélène explained the unwritten rules of garrison life. which officers' wives were approachable and which were better avoided, where to purchase the best food at the lowest prices, how to supplement military rations with foraging and trading, which native women sold high-quality furs and goods at fair rates. You'll also want to learn some medical skills, Helen advised. When the men are injured on patrol, we wives often do the nursing. The garrison surgeon is competent but overwhelmed. Learning to treat basic wounds, fevers, infections, that knowledge saves lives. I know some healing. My mother taught me herbs and remedies before she died. Good. You'll use that knowledge more than you expect. Marguerite also learned the rhythms of military life. Luke rose before dawn for morning formation, spent his days training men or standing guard duty, returned exhausted in the evening. 2 weeks after their wedding, Luke was assigned to a 5-day patrol checking settlements north of Quebec for signs of Iroquois activity. "I'll be back by Friday," Luke told Marguerite the morning of departure, gathering his equipment, musket, powder, rations, bedroll. "Be careful," Marguerite said, fighting the urge to cling to him. They had shared a bed for 2 weeks now, had consummated their marriage with an awkwardness that was gradually giving way to comfort, and had begun to know each other more than strangers. The thought of him in danger made her chest tight with anxiety. "I'm always careful. It's my job." Luke kissed her forehead. "Don't worry too much. Patrols like this are usually uneventful. Long walks through forest, checking on habitants, then home." But he returned 7 days late, carried on a makeshift stretcher by 2 of his men, with a musket ball lodged in his left shoulder and fever burning through his body. Marguerite heard the commotion, shouting, running boots, urgent voices, and ran from their quarters to find Luke carrying toward the garrison surgeon room. His face was gray with pain and fever, his uniform dark with dried blood. "What happened?" she demanded, trying to follow, but a soldier blocked her. "Iroquois ambush, madame. 3 days ago. We got most of the squad out, but Sergeant Fontaine took a ball covering the retreat. We've been moving as fast as we could, but he's in bad shape." The garrison surgeon, a harried man named Dr. Beaumont, worked on Luke for 2 hours while Marguerite waited outside with Hélène Gagnon, who had appeared to offer support. "Is he going to die?" Marguerite asked, her voice barely steady. "Not if Beaumont can get the ball out and the infection doesn't set in. Your husband is strong, and he got treatment quickly. That improves his chances." When Beaumont finally emerged, his hands blood-stained and his expression exhausted, he addressed Marguerite directly. "I've removed the musket ball and cleaned the wound as best I can. Now it's a matter of whether infection develops. He needs constant care, cleaning the wound, managing fever, forcing fluids. Can you provide that?" "Yes." "Then take him to your quarters. Keep him immobile for at least a week. Watch for signs of infection, increased redness, pus, worsening fever. If you see any of those, come get me immediately." Luke was moved to their quarters, where he lay on their narrow bed in a haze of fever and pain. Marguerite threw herself into nursing him with a fierce determination born of fear. She cleaned his wound multiple times daily, changing bandages, applying poultices made from herbs Helene provided. She forced water and broth between his lips when he could swallow, bathed him with cool cloths when fever spiked, stayed awake through long nights watching for any change in his condition. On the 3rd day, infection set in despite her best efforts. The wound grew red and angry, pus forming despite constant cleaning. Luke's fever climbed dangerously high, and he began to thrash in delirium, calling out orders to his men, reliving the ambush. Dr. Beaumont examined him with a grim expression. "The infection is spreading. I can try lancing the wound more aggressively, draining the infection, but it's risky. Or we can wait and hope his body fights it off naturally, which is also risky. There's no good option here." "Lance it," Marguerite decided. "He's strong enough to survive the procedure. Waiting just lets the infection spread further."
Beaumont nodded, respecting her judgment. "I'll need you to hold him down. This will be painful, and even in his delirium he'll fight." The procedure was as horrible as Marguerite had feared. Luc screamed when Beaumont cut into infected flesh, draining pus and blood. It took 3 men to hold him down, while Marguerite whispered desperately in his ear, trying to provide any comfort she could while he endured agony. Afterward, Luc collapsed into unconsciousness while Marguerite cleaned and rebandaged the wound, her hands shaking with exhaustion and fear. "You did well," Beaumont said. "Now we wait. Either the fever breaks in the next day or 2, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. That night, Marguerite knelt beside their bed and prayed with an intensity she hadn't felt since her parents died. She prayed to the Virgin Mary, to St. Luke the physician, to any saint who might intercede for a wounded soldier who didn't deserve to die in his first month of marriage. She had crossed an ocean to build a life in New France. She had married Luc Fontaine, believing they would have years to build that life together. The thought of losing him now, of becoming a widow before she'd barely been a wife, was unbearable. "Don't die," she whispered to his unconscious form. "Please, Luc, don't leave me alone in this place. I need you." Near dawn, his fever broke. Marguerite woke from exhausted half-sleep to find him looking at her with clear eyes for the first time in days. "Marguerite?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "What happened?" "You were wounded. Infection set in. You've been delirious for 3 days." She pressed her forehead to his, hardly daring to believe the fever had actually broken. "How do you feel?" "Like hell, but alive." A weak smile. "You've been nursing me? Who else would?" "Thank you." His hand found hers, grip weak but present. "I said being a soldier's wife would be difficult. You weren't lying." "No, I try never to lie." Over the following 2 weeks, Luc slowly recovered. His wound healed, though it would leave an angry scar. His strength returned gradually, and he began moving around their quarters, then venturing outside for short walks. Dr. Beaumont pronounced him fortunate to be alive and predicted full recovery within a month. But the experience had changed something between them. Marguerite had seen Luc at his most vulnerable, had fought for his life, had faced the very real possibility of losing him. And Luc had experienced being completely dependent on her, trusting his survival to her competence and dedication. "I owe you my life," he said one evening as they sat together, his recovering shoulder still bound, but the danger past. "I should have died from that infection, but you fought for me. You're my husband. What else would I do?" Many wives would have let nature take its course, especially wives who barely know their husbands, who married out of necessity rather than affection. "You could have been free of me, free to find a better match." "I didn't want to be free of you." Marguerite realized as she said it that it was true. In 3 weeks of marriage, she had come to value Luc's steady presence, his respect for her, his quiet integrity. The thought of losing him was genuinely painful, not just practically inconvenient. "I'm glad," Luc said quietly, "because I've come to value you more than I expected. This marriage began as a practical arrangement, but it's becoming something more, at least for me." "For me, too," Marguerite admitted. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching firelight flicker against stone walls. Outside, Quebec settled into autumn, the brief summer giving way to the long cold that would define the coming months. Marguerite thought about the choice she had made, to marry a soldier rather than accept easier options, to risk this uncertain partnership rather than settle for guaranteed but empty security. It had nearly cost her everything in the first month. But sitting here now, with Luc recovering beside her, with the beginning of genuine affection growing between them, she didn't regret her choice. Whatever hardships lay ahead, and Thérèse Morel had promised there would be many, at least she would face them with a partner worth fighting for. That was more than she had dared hope for when she boarded the Saint-François in Dieppe all those months ago. And for Marguerite Fontaine, it was enough. Luc returned to light duties in September, though Captain Moreau exempted him from patrol assignments for 2 more months while his shoulder fully healed. Instead, he trained new recruits, supervised guard rotations, and handled administrative work that kept him close to the garrison. Marguerite was grateful for his presence, even as she saw the frustration in his eyes at being confined to routine tasks while his men went out on patrol. "I should be with them," he said one evening, watching from the garrison walls as a squad departed for a week-long patrol. "Mercier is competent, but those are my men. They're accustomed to my leadership." "They're also accustomed to you being alive," Marguerite replied. "Your shoulder hasn't fully healed. Another injury could cripple you permanently." "The surgeon has cleared me for duty." "Beaumont said light duty, not patrols into hostile territory." Marguerite moved beside him at the wall, looking out over the darkening forest. "Luc, I understand your frustration, but you nearly died. Give your body time to heal properly." He sighed but nodded. "You're right. I just feel useless." "You're training the new recruits. That's hardly useless. Those men will carry your teaching with them for years." It was true. The garrison had received 15 new soldiers in August, young men fresh from France who knew nothing about wilderness warfare or dealing with native tribes. Luc spent his days teaching them survival skills, combat tactics, and the particular challenges of fighting in New Francis forests. He was a natural instructor, patient, clear, demanding but fair. "Sergeant Fontaine is a gift," one of the young recruits, a boy named André Roche, told Marguerite one day when she brought Luc his midday meal. "He doesn't just tell us what to do, he explains why, makes us understand the reasoning behind tactics. The other sergeants just bark orders and expect obedience." "My husband values thinking soldiers over merely obedient ones," Marguerite replied, feeling a flush of pride. "Some of the officers don't like it. I heard Lieutenant Dupont complaining that Fontaine encourages insubordination by teaching men to question commands." This concern proved prescient. In October, Captain Moreau summoned Luc to his office. Marguerite knew something was wrong when Luc returned to their quarters with his jaw clenched tight and his eyes dark with barely suppressed anger. "What happened?" she asked. "Moreau reprimanded me, said I'm undermining discipline by teaching recruits to think critically rather than simply obey. He's ordered me to change my training methods, focus on rote drill and immediate obedience to orders without question." "Can you do that?" "I can, but I won't." Luc began pacing their small room, his frustration evident in every movement. "Mindlessly obedient soldiers get killed in the wilderness. They follow orders into ambushes because they don't recognize dangerous situations. They fail to adapt when circumstances change. I'm trying to keep these boys alive, and Moreau wants me to turn them into automatons." "What will you do?" "Continue training them properly. If Moreau wants to discipline me for that, so be it." Marguerite felt a chill of foreboding. Thérèse Morel's warning echoed in her mind. Luc is a good man, but good men can be inconvenient in military structures that value obedience over independent thought. "Luc, you're still recovering. You don't have the leverage you once did. If you defy Moreau openly—" "I'm not defying him. I'm interpreting his orders in a way that accomplishes the mission, creating competent soldiers, rather than just satisfying arbitrary standards for discipline." "That's a distinction he might not appreciate." "Then he'll have to court-martial me. which he won't do because I'm the best training sergeant he has and he knows it." Marguerite wanted to argue further, but recognized the stubborn set of Luke's jaw. This was who he was, a man who stood by his principles even when pragmatism would serve better. She had married him knowing this quality, had valued it when they met. She couldn't ask him to abandon his integrity now because it proved inconvenient. But she worried, and her worry grew when winter descended on Quebec with brutal force. November brought snow that buried the settlement under white drifts, temperatures so cold that water froze within minutes of being drawn from wells, winds that howled to every crack in the garrison walls. Marguerite learned to keep fires burning constantly, to layer every piece of clothing she owned, to melt snow for water when the wells froze completely. Food became scarce. The garrison stores were adequate for the soldiers, but barely sufficient. Wives and children were expected to supplement military rations through their own resourcefulness, preserving summer vegetables, trading with habitants and native women, rationing carefully. Hélène Gagnon taught Marguerite the essential skills of winter survival, how to recognize edible plants even under snow, how to smoke meat to preserve it, how to make soap from animal fat, how to repair clothes until they literally fell apart, then salvage the fabric for other uses. "Quebec winters break some people," Hélène Gagnon said one December afternoon as they worked together making candles from rendered fat. "Especially newcomers who arrive expecting European winters and get this instead. Every year, a few give up and return to France on the spring ships. Others just stop trying, sit in their quarters and wait for winter to end, growing thinner and sadder until they're barely alive." "How do you survive it?" asked Marguerite. "By staying active, by helping others, by remembering that winter always ends even when it feels eternal." Hélène smiled. "And by appreciating the small warmths, a good fire, a hot meal, a husband who comes home safe from patrol." But not all husbands came home safe. In December, a patrol was caught in a blizzard 20 miles north of Quebec. 3 men died of exposure before the survivors struggled back to the garrison with blackened fingers and toes that would require amputation. One of the dead was Corporal Gagnon, Hélène's husband. Marguerite learned of the deaths when Luke came to their quarters ashen-faced and exhausted from helping search for the lost patrol. She knew before he spoke that something terrible had happened. "Gagnon is dead," he said simply, "froze to death along with 2 others. Hélène is a widow now." Marguerite felt her stomach drop. Hélène, kind, practical Hélène, who had taught her so much, who had been her first real friend in Quebec, now a widow at 25, with no income and no prospects. What will happen to her? She'll receive Gagnon's pension, 8 livres a month, barely enough to survive on. She'll probably have to remarry quickly or find work as a servant. She shouldn't have to remarry immediately if she doesn't want to. Life in New France doesn't always allow for what people want, only what's necessary for survival. Marguerite went to Hélène immediately, finding her in the small quarters she had shared with her husband, surrounded by other garrison wives offering condolences and practical assistance. Hélène's face was dry-eyed but hollow, the shock of sudden widowhood evident in her vacant expression. "I'm so sorry," Marguerite said, embracing her friend. "He was a good man," Hélène said mechanically. "We had 3 good years together. That's more than many get." Over the following days, Marguerite watched the garrison community rally around Hélène, wives bringing food, men offering to chop wood or fetch water, everyone contributing what little they could spare to help the widow through the immediate crisis. It was the solidarity Teresa Morel had described, the way garrison families supported each other because survival demanded it. But Marguerite also saw the calculating looks from several unmarried soldiers and widowers, men assessing Elaine as a potential wife now that she was available again. The thought made her sick. Elaine's husband was barely cold, and already men were positioning themselves to claim her. "It's how things work here," Luke explained when Marguerite expressed disgust. "Widows rarely stay unmarried long. They need protection and provision. Men need wives and household management. It's practical, not heartless." "It feels heartless." "Perhaps, but this isn't a world that allows for extended mourning. Winter doesn't care about grief, and neither do hunger or cold. Elaine will remarry within months because she must, not because she wants to." Christmas came, celebrated with midnight mass and a feast organized by the officers. Marguerite attended with Luke, noting the social hierarchies even in celebration. Officers and their wives at the head table, enlisted men and their families at lower tables, the subtle but unmistakable segregation that defined military life. Captain Moreau made a speech about solidarity and sacrifice, about how the garrison was a family that took care of its own. It was fine rhetoric, but Marguerite couldn't forget that this same captain had reprimanded Luke for training soldiers to think independently, had valued obedience over effectiveness. After the celebration, as they walked back to their quarters through snow-covered streets, Luke suddenly stopped. "What's wrong?" Marguerite asked. "I've been offered a promotion. Captain Moreau informed me this afternoon." "That's wonderful! Lieutenant Fontaine. It has a fine ring to it." "There are conditions." Luke's expression was troubled. "I would be transferred to Montreal, assigned to a different garrison, and I would need to adopt training methods that align with Captain Beauharnois' preferences, which means abandoning everything I believe about preparing soldiers for wilderness warfare." Marguerite felt her brief joy evaporate. "They want you to choose between advancement and principles." "Exactly. Accept the promotion and compromise my integrity, or refuse and remain a sergeant under Moreau's increasingly hostile supervision." "What will you do?" Luke was silent for a long moment, snowflakes settling on his shoulders and hair. "I don't know. If I were alone, I'd refuse without hesitation, but I'm not alone anymore. I have a wife to consider. The increased pay of a lieutenant would make your life easier, more secure. It's not just about my pride anymore." Marguerite understood the weight of his dilemma. The promotion would mean better quarters, higher pay, improved social standing, all things that would benefit her directly. But it would also mean Luke becoming someone different, abandoning the principles that had made her respect him in the first place. "What do you want me to say?" she asked quietly. "I want you to tell me what you need, what kind of husband you need me to be, one who advances his career through compromise, or one who stays true to his beliefs even if it costs us." Marguerite thought of her life before New France, her uncle's tavern, his wandering hands, the compromises she had made daily just to survive. She thought of how she had nearly accepted Claude Beaumont's proposal because it offered security, even though it would have meant a lifetime of suffocating routine and emotional emptiness. She had chosen Luke precisely because he was different, because he valued principles over pragmatism, integrity over advancement. If he accepted this promotion and changed who he was, she would be living with a different person, perhaps more comfortable, but fundamentally altered. "I didn't marry you for advancement or social standing. I married you because you were honest, because you stood by your principles, because you offered genuine partnership. If you compromise those things for a promotion, you'll become someone else, someone I don't know as well." "So I should refuse?" "I'm saying I'd rather live in these cramped quarters with the man I married than in better quarters with someone who's betrayed his own values. The choice is yours, but know that I'll support whatever you decide, even if we never advance beyond this single room and a sergeant's pay." Luke pulled her close, his embrace fierce despite the cold. "I don't deserve you. You deserve a partner who believes in the same things you do. That's all I'm offering. It's everything." The next day, Luke informed Captain Moreau that he was declining the promotion. Moreau's reaction was predictably hostile. "You're a fool, Fontaine. Opportunities like this don't come often. Refuse this and you'll remain a sergeant for the rest of your service." "I understand, sir, but I can't accept a promotion that requires me to abandon training methods I believe keep soldiers alive. My principles are non-negotiable." "Your principles will keep you poor and insignificant, but very well, remain a sergeant. Just don't expect any preferential treatment going forward." The threat was clear. Luke had made an enemy of his commanding officer by refusing to compromise. The consequences would follow. They began almost immediately. Luke was assigned the worst duties: overnight watches and brutal cold, training sessions during the harshest weather, administrative work that kept him from the soldiers he trained. It was petty harassment designed to make his life miserable and demonstrate the cost of defying authority. Marguerite watched her husband grow thin and exhausted, returning from 18-hour shifts barely able to stand. She did what she could, ensuring hot food waited for him, managing their household so he didn't have to worry about domestic concerns, providing comfort when frustration threatened to overwhelm him. "This is my fault," she said one February evening when Luke returned from yet another brutal overnight watch, his face gray with exhaustion. "If I had encouraged you to accept the promotion, then I would be in Montreal, comfortable and miserable, wondering every day if I was the kind of man you could respect. This is hard, but at least I can still look at myself in a mirror without shame." But Marguerite could see the toll it was taking. Luke was being systematically ground down by Moreau's petty tyranny, his health and spirit eroding under the weight of constant harassment. Something had to change. They couldn't sustain this indefinitely. The breaking point came in late February when one of Luke's former trainees, young André Roche, the recruit who had praised Luke's teaching methods, was killed on patrol. The circumstances were suspicious. André's squad had been ordered to investigate reports of Iroquois activity in an area known to be dangerous, with insufficient men and equipment. When they were ambushed, André was killed trying to hold a defensive position while the others retreated. Luke heard the news and something inside him snapped. He marched directly to Captain Moreau's office and confronted him in front of 3 other officers. "André Roche died because you sent him into a known danger zone with an understrength squad," Luke said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "That patrol should have had at least 12 men, not 8. You knew that area was high risk, and you sent them anyway. Why?" "Watch your tone, Sergeant. I don't answer to you." "Then answer to Roche's memory. That boy was 19 years old. He had family in France who sent him here believing we'd keep him safe. Instead, you treated his squad as expendable. Get out of my office before I have you arrested for insubordination." "Gladly, but this isn't over. I'm writing a report about this incident and sending it to Quebec's military command. They need to know how you're commanding this garrison." Marguerite learned about the confrontation when Helene, who had remarried a month earlier to a corporal named Petit, came to their quarters with a warning. "Luke challenged Moreau in front of witnesses. The captain is furious. He's talking about court-martial, about having Luke arrested and charged with gross insubordination." Marguerite felt ice in her veins. "Can he do that?" "He's the commanding officer. He can do whatever he wants, and after what Luke said, he has grounds." Helene gripped Marguerite's hands. "Your husband needs to apologize, publicly, formally. It's the only way to diffuse this." But when Marguerite told Luke what Helene had said, his expression was adamant. "I won't apologize for speaking truth.
Roach died because of Moreau's negligence. If pointing that out costs me my career or even my freedom, so be it. Luke, think about this. If you're court-martialed, you could be imprisoned or cashiered. We'd have nothing. No income, no home, no future. We'd have each other and our integrity. That has to be worth something. Integrity doesn't keep us fed or sheltered. Neither does cowardice. They stared at each other, the tension crackling between them. This was the crisis Marguerite had feared since their marriage, the moment when Luke's principles would collide irreconcilably with practical survival. She had known it would come eventually. She just hadn't expected it to arrive so soon and so catastrophically. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, finally, her voice breaking. "Support you while you destroy our lives over principle, or convince you to compromise and hate myself for it?" "I want you to trust me," Luke said quietly. "Trust that standing up for what's right matters, even when the cost is high. Trust that some things are worth fighting for, even if we lose everything else." Marguerite looked at her husband, exhausted, stubborn, principled to a fault. The man she had chosen over safer, more practical options. The man whose integrity had made her fall in love with him. She had made her choice when she married him. Now she had to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. "Then I trust you. We'll face whatever comes together. But Luke, if we lose everything, if you're court-martialed and we're left with nothing, promise me we'll find a way to survive. Promise me you won't let pride be more important than our lives." "I promise. But Marguerite, I also promise I'll never become the kind of man who stays silent when speaking could save lives. That's non-negotiable." "I know, and I wouldn't want you to be anyone other than who you are." They held each other in their cramped quarters as snow fell outside and the garrison settled into tense anticipation of whatever would happen next. Marguerite didn't know what the morning would bring: court-martial, dismissal, public humiliation, or some other consequence of her husband's refusal to compromise. But she knew one thing with certainty: she had married the right man. Whatever the cost, whatever the hardship, she would rather face it with Luc Fontaine than live comfortably with someone who had abandoned their principles for convenience. That conviction would be tested severely in the days to come, but for now it was enough to sustain her through the long, cold night. Captain Moreau moved swiftly. 2 days after Luke's confrontation, formal charges were filed: gross insubordination, disrespect to a superior officer, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. The court-martial was scheduled for March 15th to be presided over by a military tribunal from Quebec's main garrison. 3 officers will hear the case, Luke explained to Marguerite after receiving the formal notification. Major Brisebois from Quebec, Captain Deschamps from Trois-Rivières, and Captain Moreau himself. "Moreau will be one of your judges? How is that fair?" "It isn't, but military justice isn't designed to be fair. It's designed to maintain discipline and authority. Moreau is within his rights to sit on the tribunal since he's the officer I'm accused of insulting." "What will happen if you're found guilty?" "Depending on the severity, reduction in rank, imprisonment, dishonorable discharge, possibly all 3. At minimum, I'll be stripped of my sergeant's rank. At worst," he trailed off, but Marguerite understood. Military law allowed for harsh punishments, including execution in extreme cases of insubordination during wartime. The garrison buzzed with speculation. Some soldiers quietly supported Luke, believing his critique of Moreau's command decisions was justified. Others sided with the captain, arguing that questioning orders undermined the entire military structure. The officers' wives maintained icy distance from Marguerite, as if insubordination might be contagious. Only Hélène remained steadfast, visiting daily despite her new husband's warnings that associating with Marguerite could damage his own standing.
I don't care what Jacques says, Hélène told Marguerite firmly. You were there for me when Gagnon died. I'll be here for you now. The week before the court-martial, Marguerite received an unexpected visitor. Major Brisebois, one of the officers who would judge Luc's case, appeared at her door in civilian clothes, clearly seeking to avoid drawing attention. Madame Fontaine, may I speak with you privately? Marguerite let him in warily, unsure what this could mean. Brisebois was perhaps 45, graying but fit, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service. I'm here unofficially, he said once they were seated. What I'm about to say cannot be repeated, especially not to your husband. Do I have your word? That depends on what you're going to say. Brisebois smiled slightly. Fair enough. I'll be direct. I've reviewed the charges against your husband, and I've made inquiries about both him and Captain Moreau. What I've learned troubles me. In what way? Your husband has a reputation as an excellent soldier and trainer, demanding but fair, innovative in his methods, deeply concerned with his men's welfare. Captain Moreau, by contrast, has a reputation for viewing soldiers as expendable resources and prioritizing discipline over effectiveness. The patrol that resulted in André Roche's death was indeed ordered into known danger with insufficient strength. Your husband's criticism, while insubordinate in form, was accurate in substance. Marguerite felt a flicker of hope. Then you'll find him not guilty. I didn't say that. What your husband did was still insubordination, regardless of whether his critique was justified. Military discipline requires that such concerns be raised through proper channels, not in public confrontations. I can't simply dismiss the charges without undermining the entire command structure. Then why are you here? Because there are different degrees of guilt and different possible punishments. If your husband demonstrates appropriate contrition, if he acknowledges that how he expressed concerns was improper, even if the concerns themselves were valid, I can argue for leniency, perhaps a formal reprimand and temporary reduction in rank rather than imprisonment or discharge. You want him to apologize to Moreau? I want him to acknowledge that military protocol exists for good reasons, even when it's frustrating. He doesn't have to say he was wrong about the substance of his criticism, just that he should have raised it through proper channels. Marguerite understood the political calculation. Brisebois was offering a way out that would allow Luc to maintain his essential integrity while making the necessary gestures to preserve military discipline. It was a compromise, but not a capitulation. I'll talk to him, said Marguerite. But Major, he's stubborn. If he believes apologizing would mean betraying his principles, he won't do it regardless of consequences. Then help him understand that refusing to apologize isn't principle, it's pride. There's a difference. Brisebois stood to leave. The court-martial is in 5 days. Consider carefully what I've said. Your husband's future, and yours, depends on the choices he makes in that hearing. After Brisebois left, Marguerite sat alone in their quarters, wrestling with what to tell Luc. If she revealed Brisebois' visit, Luc might view it as attempted manipulation and dig in harder. But if she said nothing and he was convicted of the full charges, she would always wonder if she could have prevented it. She decided to tell him everything, trusting that their partnership required honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. Luc's reaction was exactly what she feared. Brisebois wants me to grovel, to pretend that speaking truth was improper because it made Moreau uncomfortable. I won't do it. He's not asking you to grovel. He's offering you a way to acknowledge that how you spoke was problematic while maintaining that what you said was accurate. That's not the same as betraying your principles. It's splitting hairs to save face. The substance is still an apology to a man who got one of my soldiers killed through negligence. An apology that would keep you out of prison. An apology that would preserve your career and our future. Marguerite heard her voice rising and forced herself to take a breath. Luc, I'm not asking you to lie or compromise your values. I'm asking you to recognize that there is a difference between standing by your principles and destroying yourself through stubbornness. Are they different? How do I know where one ends and the other begins? By asking whether refusing to compromise serves any purpose beyond your own pride. Will your refusal to acknowledge improper protocol bring André Roche back? Will it change how Moreau commands? Or will it simply punish you, punish us, while accomplishing nothing? Luke was silent for a long time, his expression troubled. Finally, he said quietly, "I need to think about this, alone. I'll take a walk." He left, and Marguerite remained in their quarters, staring at the walls that might not be theirs much longer. She had done what she could, presented the option, explained the stakes. Now the choice was Luke's, and she would have to accept whatever he decided, even if his decision destroyed everything they had built together. The court-martial convened in the garrison's administrative building, a somber stone structure that seemed designed to intimidate. Marguerite sat in the small gallery reserved for observers, along with a handful of other soldiers' wives and a few curious onlookers. Helene sat beside her, providing silent support. The tribunal sat behind a long table, Major Brisebois in the center, Captain Moreau to his right, Captain Deschamps to his left. All three wore full-dress uniforms, their expressions formal and impassive. Major Brisebois read the charges formally. "Sergeant Luc Fontaine, you are charged with gross insubordination, disrespect to a superior officer, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. Specifically, you are accused of publicly confronting Captain Moreau, questioning his command decisions, and threatening to report him to higher authority in a manner that constituted insubordination and disrespect. How do you plead?" "I plead guilty to the charges as stated, with explanation," Luke said clearly. Brisebois nodded. "Proceed with your explanation." "I did confront Captain Moreau publicly, I did question his command decisions, and I did express my intention to report concerns to higher authority. In all these actions, I violated military protocol. I should have raised my concerns through proper channels, private conversation with my commanding officer, followed by formal reports through the chain of command if my concerns were not addressed. By choosing public confrontation, I undermined discipline and disrespected Captain Moreau's position." So far, this was the apology Brisebois suggested. Marguerite felt cautious relief. But then Luke continued, "However, I want this tribunal to understand why I acted as I did, even though it doesn't excuse the violation of protocol. Private André Roche died as a result of a command decision that sent an understrength patrol into known high-risk territory. This was the third decision by Captain Moreau in recent months that resulted in unnecessary casualties. I had previously raised concerns through proper channels, private conversations with the captain, written memoranda suggesting alternative approaches. These concerns were dismissed or ignored. When Roche died, I lost control and confronted the captain publicly, which was wrong, but my underlying critique of his command decisions remains valid, and soldiers continue to be at risk due to those decisions." Captain Moreau's face had gone red. "This is not an opportunity for you to continue your insubordination by criticizing my command." "Captain Moreau," Brisebois said sharply, "you will have opportunity to respond. For now, Sergeant Fontaine is addressing the tribunal." He turned back to Luke. "You acknowledge that your actions were improper." "I do, sir." "And you understand that military discipline requires adherence to protocol even when an individual disagrees with specific command decisions." "I do, sir." "Then we will hear from Captain Moreau regarding both the charges and Sergeant Fontaine's explanation." Moreau stood, his posture rigid with anger. "What Sergeant Fontaine calls explanation is simply more insubordination dressed in respectful language. He continues to question my judgment, to suggest that his understanding of command is superior to mine. This is exactly the attitude that led to his original offense.
As for his claims about previous concerns raised through proper channels, they were not concerns, but constant challenges to my authority. Sergeant Fontaine has a pattern of questioning orders, of encouraging his men to think independently rather than simply obey, of suggesting that junior soldiers should evaluate and potentially refuse commands they disagree with. This is corrosive to military discipline. The confrontation 2 weeks ago was simply the culmination of months of problematic behavior. "Do you have documentation of this pattern?" Brisebois asked. "I have multiple instances where Sergeant Fontaine questioned orders or suggested alternative approaches when his role was simply to execute commands as given. I can provide detailed accounts if the tribunal requires." "That won't be necessary for now. Captain Deschamps, do you have questions for either the defendant or Captain Moreau?" Deschamps, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant Fontaine, in your explanation, you mentioned 3 incidents where Captain Moreau's decisions resulted in unnecessary casualties. Can you provide specific details?" Luke proceeded to describe 3 patrols over the past 4 months, including the one that killed André Roach, where command decisions directly contributed to soldier deaths or serious injuries. His recitation was precise, factual, devastating in its details. Marguerite watched the tribunal's expressions and saw Major Brisebois taking careful notes, while Captain Deschamps listened with growing concern. "Captain Moreau," Captain Deschamps said when Luke finished, "how do you respond to these specific allegations?" "They represent second-guessing by a junior officer who doesn't understand the full context of command decisions. Every patrol involves risk. Sergeant Fontaine seems to believe we should avoid all risk, which would mean abandoning our mission to protect the colony. I make decisions based on available intelligence and strategic necessity. Sometimes those decisions result in casualties. That's the nature of military service." "But were these particular decisions sound?" Captain Deschamps pressed. "Sending 8 men into known high-risk territory when 12 would be standard strength. Can you explain the reasoning?"
We had limited manpower available. I had to balance multiple priorities. In hindsight, perhaps the patrol should have been delayed until more men were available, but at the time, the intelligence suggested immediate investigation was necessary. "Intelligence from what source?" Moreau hesitated. "From a habitant report of possible Iroquois scouting activity in the area." A single unverified report that constituted sufficient intelligence to justify sending an understrength patrol into danger? Marguerite saw Moreau beginning to founder, his justification sounding increasingly weak under Deschamps' questioning. Brisebois watched with an unreadable expression, occasionally making notes. The hearing continued for 2 more hours, with both sides presenting their cases. Other soldiers were called to testify about Luke's training methods and his relationship with Captain Moreau. The picture that emerged was complex. A talented, principled sergeant who genuinely cared about his men, but who chafed under the command of an officer who valued obedience over effectiveness. Finally, Brisebois called for a recess while the tribunal deliberated. Luke was escorted to a holding room, while Marguerite waited anxiously in the gallery. "He handled himself well," Hélène whispered. "He acknowledged wrongdoing but defended his reasoning. That's the best he could do. But will it be enough? I don't know. Moreau wants him punished severely, that's obvious, but Brisebois and Deschamps seem more thoughtful. They might recognize that Luke's critique has merit, even if his method was improper." 2 hours passed before the tribunal reconvened. Luke was brought back to stand before the 3 officers, his face impassive, but his hands clenched behind his back. Major Brisebois stood to deliver the verdict.
Sergeant Luc Fontaine, this tribunal has carefully considered the charges, your explanation, and all testimony presented. We find you guilty of insubordination and disrespect to a superior officer. These are serious charges that cannot be dismissed, regardless of any justifications you might offer for your actions. Marguerite felt her stomach drop. Guilty. Luc was guilty. The punishments could be devastating. However, Brisebois continued, his gaze shifting to Moreau, we also recognize that your concerns about command decisions were raised through proper channels before your improper public confrontation. We further recognize that your critique had substantial merit. Captain Moreau's command decisions in the cases you cited do appear to have unnecessarily endangered soldiers under his command. Moreau's face went from red to purple, but he remained silent. Therefore, this tribunal has determined the following sentence. You are hereby reduced in rank to corporal, effective immediately. You will receive a formal reprimand that will be placed in your permanent military record. Additionally, you are transferred to the garrison at Montreal, where you will serve out the remainder of your term under different command. This transfer takes effect within 2 weeks. Relief flooded through Marguerite so powerfully she felt dizzy. Not imprisonment, not dishonorable discharge, just reduction in rank and transfer. Serious consequences, but survivable. Furthermore, Brisebois continued, his gaze shifting to Moreau, this tribunal recommends that Captain Moreau undergo additional training in wilderness command tactics and that future patrol assignments in this garrison be reviewed by Montreal Command before execution. While Corporal Fontaine's method of raising concerns was improper, the concerns themselves suggest deficiencies in command that require attention. It was as close as military protocol allowed to acknowledging that Luc had been right, even if his methods were wrong. Moreau's expression suggested he understood the implicit rebuke. This tribunal is dismissed. Corporal Fontaine, you are released from arrest. Report to the garrison quartermaster for reassignment of quarters and duties. Luc saluted crisply, his face showing no emotion, and was dismissed. Marguerite waited in the gallery until he emerged, then followed him outside where they could speak privately. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm a corporal instead of a sergeant. I've lost rank, pay, and respect, but I'm not in prison and we're not starving in the street. I suppose that's as good as I could hope for." "It's better than that. Brisebois essentially validated your concerns while punishing you for improper protocol. That's actually a victory of sorts." "A Pyrrhic victory. I've made an enemy of Moreau and shown everyone that questioning authority leads to punishment. I'm not sure how much good that does anyone." "You're alive. You're free. We're being transferred to Montreal, which means a fresh start under different command. That's not nothing." He pulled her close, his embrace tight. "You're right. I'm angry at how this system works, at how speaking truth gets punished while negligence gets excused, at how I had to apologize for being right just to avoid being destroyed." "You didn't apologize for being right. You apologized for being insubordinate. There's a difference." "Is there? It feels like the same thing sometimes." "Then feel that way for tonight. Tomorrow we start planning our move to Montreal and our new life there. But tonight you're allowed to be angry at injustice." They returned to their quarters, where they would live for 2 more weeks before the transfer. Marguerite looked around the cramped room that had been their home for 8 months, the scene of Luc's near death and recovery, of their growing understanding of each other, of long winter nights spent planning a future that had nearly been destroyed by his principles. She had married a man who stood by his convictions even when it cost him dearly. Today, she had learned exactly how costly those convictions could be and how close they had come to losing everything. But they had survived.
diminished perhaps, forced to relocate and start over, but together and with their essential integrity intact. For Marguerite Fontaine, who had crossed an ocean not knowing if she would even survive the journey, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The transfer to Montreal took place in early April, just as ice began breaking on the St. Lawrence. Luc and Marguerite traveled by boat with their few possessions, watching Quebec recede behind them with mixed feelings. The settlement had been their home, but it held difficult memories. Luc's near death, the court-martial, the constant tension with Captain Moreau. Montreal promised a fresh start, though neither harbored illusions that military life would suddenly become easy. The journey took 3 days against the spring current. They shared the boat with 2 other soldiers being transferred and several habitants returning to farms upriver. Marguerite spent the time watching the landscape slide past, endless forest punctuated by occasional cleared settlements, the raw wilderness that still defined most of New France. "It's beautiful in a harsh way," she observed to Luc as they passed a particularly dense stretch of forest. "Like it could kill you, but at least it would be beautiful while doing it." That's New France in a phrase, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Montreal revealed itself as larger than Quebec, perhaps 1,500 souls, but more roughly built, less established. The town sprawled along the riverbank, dominated by the Sulpician Seminary and a fortified stone building that served as military headquarters. The garrison here was twice the size of Quebec's, reflecting Montreal's position as the colony's western frontier, most exposed to both Iroquois raids and English expansion from the south. They reported to the garrison commander, Captain Beauchamp, a man of perhaps 50, with the grizzled look of someone who had spent decades on the frontier. He reviewed Luc's transfer orders with a thoughtful expression. "I've heard about you, Fontaine," the sergeant who became a corporal for speaking his mind. Beauchamp's tone was neutral, neither approving nor disapproving. "Major Brisebois sent a private letter along with your orders. He suggests you're an excellent soldier with unfortunate timing and an inability to keep your opinions to yourself. Is that a problem, sir?" "Depends on the opinions and the timing. I run this garrison differently than Moreau runs Quebec. I value competence over blind obedience, and I encourage my men to think independently, within limits. But I also expect discipline and proper protocol. Can you work within that structure?" "I can, sir." "We'll see. Your rank is corporal, but you have sergeant-level experience. I'm assigning you to Sergeant Belmont's squad, 12 men patrolling the western settlements of Montreal. You'll assist Belmont with training and patrol duties. Prove yourself reliable, and we'll discuss whether you can earn back your sergeant's stripes eventually." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. Montreal's garrison faces more danger than Quebec's. The Iroquois are more active here, and we're closer to English territory. Your training methods that got you in trouble in Quebec might actually be useful here, where unconventional thinking can mean the difference between survival and ambush. Just remember, I need soldiers who can think for themselves and follow orders. Both, not either or." Beauchamp arranged quarters for them, a slightly larger room than they'd had in Quebec, in a stone building that housed married soldiers and their families. It was still modest, but it felt like luxury after their cramped previous quarters. "We're starting over," Marguerite said as they unpacked their belongings. "New garrison, new command, new possibilities." "Or just new ways to make the same mistakes," Luc replied, but he smiled when he said it. "Though Beauchamp does seem different from Moreau, more pragmatic, less concerned with rigid hierarchy. Then maybe you'll thrive here. Maybe the reduction in rank will turn out to be a blessing, removing you from a toxic situation and placing you somewhere your skills are actually valued." Ever the optimist. Someone has to be. Over the following weeks, Marguerite established herself in Montreal of community. She met other garrison wives, found sources for food and supplies, and discovered that Montreal's less formal atmosphere extended to social relationships. There was still hierarchy. Officers' wives occupied higher status, but it felt less rigid than in Quebec, perhaps because frontier danger created a sense of shared vulnerability that transcended rank. She also began sewing work more seriously, taking commissions from both military and civilian clients. Her skills had improved over the winter, and she discovered a talent for alterations and repairs that kept her busy enough to earn a modest income. Luke, meanwhile, adapted to his new role. Sergeant Belmont proved to be a competent, experienced soldier who welcomed Luke's expertise rather than feeling threatened by it. Their squad patrolled the western settlements regularly, and Luke found satisfaction in work that felt genuinely useful, protecting habitants, maintaining relationships with allied native communities, and occasionally pursuing raiders who threatened French interests. "This is what I should have been doing all along," he told Marguerite after returning from a successful patrol that had prevented an Iroquois raiding party from attacking an isolated farm. Not sitting in garrison performing bureaucratic duties, but actually protecting the people who need protection. "You sound happy, happier than you've been since I met you." "I am. Despite the reduction in rank, despite having to prove myself all over again, I'm doing work that matters, that's worth more than rank or pay." In May, Marguerite discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually: missed monthly courses, morning queasiness, a tenderness in her breasts. When she was certain, she told Luke one evening as they prepared for bed, "I'm going to have a baby, probably in December or early January." Luke stopped in the middle of removing his boots, his expression shifting from surprise to wonder to concern in rapid succession. "A baby? We're going to be parents. Are you pleased?"
I'm terrified and delighted in equal measure. A child, our child. Marguerite, that's extraordinary. But also, he gestured at their modest quarters, at the evidence of their simple life. We're barely managing on a corporal's pay as it is. Adding a child? We'll manage. People raise children on less, and my sewing work brings in enough to cover extra expenses. It won't be easy, but we'll make it work. You'll need to stop working once you're further along, and after the baby comes, you can't sew and care for an infant simultaneously. Then we'll find another solution. Maybe I can teach other women to sew and take a percentage of their earnings. Maybe I can sell goods rather than services. We'll adapt." Luke pulled her close, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. A baby? Our baby, born in New France, a child of this new world rather than the old. That's remarkable. It's also inevitable. We share a bed, Luke. Children tend to follow. He laughed. True, but still remarkable. We came here as strangers, married out of necessity. Now we're building a family together. That's more than I expected when I first saw you on the Quebec dock. More than I expected when I crossed an ocean to marry a dead man, Marguerite agreed. But life has a way of surprising us. The pregnancy proceeded normally through summer. Marguerite continued her sewing work, though she grew increasingly tired as her body changed. The other garrison wives rallied around her, offering advice and practical assistance. Even women she barely knew appeared with baby clothes, helpful tips, and stories of their own pregnancies and childbirths. "Community is different here," Helene observed during one of her visits. She and her new husband Jacques had also been transferred to Montreal, though under different circumstances. In Quebec, everything felt more formal, more separated by rank. Here, we're all just trying to survive together. It's better. "You sound happy, too." "I am. Jacques is a good man, not the love match that Gagnon was, but solid and reliable, and being away from Quebec, away from the memories, it helps." Helene smiled. "We're both starting over, Marguerite, building new lives in a new place. That's the promise of New France, isn't it? The chance to begin again, regardless of what came before."
In August, Luke's squad was assigned to escort a group of Jesuit missionaries traveling west to establish a mission among the Odawa people near Michilimackinac. It would be a 6-week journey there and back, the longest separation since their marriage. "I don't want to leave you," Luke said the night before departure, his hand resting on Marguerite's swelling belly. "Not when you're pregnant, not for this long. I'll be fine. The baby won't arrive for months yet, and I have friends here to help if I need anything. You have your duty." "Duty," Luke repeated with a slight edge. "Always duty. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake joining the military, if I should have been a farmer or craftsman, something that would keep me home with my family." "You'd hate farming. You'd be restless and dissatisfied within a year." "Probably, but at least I'd be home." "Go. Escort the missionaries, keep them safe, come home when the mission is complete. I'll be here waiting, and our child will be here too, growing. 6 weeks will pass faster than you think." Luke departed with his squad at dawn, and Marguerite watched them march out of the garrison, heading west into territory that was barely French, barely mapped, barely safe. She told herself not to worry, that Luke was experienced and capable, that the journey would be uneventful. But she worried anyway. The weeks passed slowly. Marguerite kept herself busy with sewing work and preparing for the baby, making small clothes, gathering supplies, learning what she could from experienced mothers about childbirth and infant care. Her body continued its transformation, the baby growing visible now, moving inside her with increasing vigor. "You're carrying well," observed Madame Beauchamp, the commander's wife, who had birthed 4 children in New France and considered herself an expert. "Strong baby by the feel of it. Probably a boy the way you're carrying high like that." "Boy or girl, as long as the baby is healthy." Spoken like a first-time mother. By the 4th, you just hope they come out screaming and breathing. Everything else is bonus. 5 weeks after Luke's departure, a courier arrived from the west with dispatches for Captain Beauchamp. Marguerite was at the market when word spread through the garrison. There had been an incident, casualties, a squad returning early. Her heart in her throat, Marguerite ran back to the garrison, pushing through crowds of soldiers and wives, gathering for news. She found Captain Beauchamp emerging from his office, his expression grim. "Captain, is it my husband? Is it Luke's squad?" "Madame Fontaine, yes, I'm afraid there was an incident. Your husband's squad was ambushed by an Iroquois raiding party 3 days from Michilimackinac. There were casualties." The world tilted. Marguerite gripped a nearby wall for support. "Is Luke? He's alive. Wounded, but alive. He's with the missionaries at a temporary camp, too injured to travel immediately. The courier says he took an arrow to the leg, painful and disabling, but not immediately life-threatening. They'll bring him back as soon as he can travel, probably within the week." Alive, wounded but alive. Marguerite felt her legs give way, and someone caught her, Helene, who had appeared beside her. "Thank God," Marguerite whispered. "Thank God he's alive." "But wounded," Helene said quietly, "and still in the wilderness, still exposed to danger." The week waiting for Luke's return was the longest of Marguerite's life. She alternated between hope and terror, between trusting that he would recover and imagining every possible complication: infection, renewed attack, worsening injury. When the squad finally returned, carried in makeshift litters by hired voyageurs, Marguerite was waiting at the garrison gate. She saw Luke's face, pale with pain but conscious, alert, and felt overwhelming relief. "You're alive," she said, taking his hand as soldiers carried him to the garrison surgeon. "Barely. That arrow came closer to my femoral artery than I'd like. Another inch and I would have bled out in minutes." Luke managed a weak smile. "Seems I have a talent for collecting serious injuries. First the musket ball, now this." "Don't joke. I've been terrified for a week." "I know. I'm sorry. But Marguerite, I'm alive. Wounded but alive. And I'm home. That's what matters." The garrison surgeon examined Luke's leg and pronounced the arrow wound serious but survivable. The arrowhead had been removed by the missionary's medical knowledge, the wound cleaned and dressed in the field. Now it needed time to heal, which meant Luke would be confined to quarters for at least a month, possibly longer. No patrols until that leg is fully healed, the surgeon ordered, and even then you'll need to rebuild strength. You're looking at 2 months minimum before you're fit for active duty. So Luke recovered in their quarters while Marguerite's pregnancy advanced, both of them nursing injuries of different kinds, his physical, hers the natural consequence of creating new life. They spent long hours together, talking and planning, preparing for the baby while Luke's leg slowly healed. "This isn't how I imagined our first year of marriage," Luke said one October evening, running his hand over Marguerite's swollen belly. "Me injured twice, you pregnant, both of us barely scraping by financially." "Isn't it, though? We're soldiers' family in New France. Danger and hardship are part of the contract. At least we're facing it together." "When did you become the optimistic one? I thought I married a practical woman who understood how harsh life could be." "I did understand, I do understand, but I've also learned that acknowledging hardship doesn't mean surrendering to despair. We're alive, Luke. We're together. A baby is coming. Those are victories worth celebrating even when everything else is difficult." The baby arrived on a freezing December night, 3 weeks before expected. Marguerite's labor began just after nightfall and lasted through the night and into the next day. Helene attended her, along with Madame Beauchamp and the garrison midwife, while Luke waited anxiously in the next room, still unable to walk without crutches. The birth was difficult, long, painful, dangerous in the way all childbirths were dangerous in New France, where medical knowledge was limited and complications could kill easily. Marguerite endured it with gritted teeth and occasional screams, pushing when told to push, breathing when told to breathe, following the midwife's instructions with desperate focus. Finally, as gray dawn light filtered through narrow windows, a thin, angry cry announced the baby's arrival. "A girl," the midwife announced, placing the bloody, squalling infant on Marguerite's chest. "Small, but healthy. She has excellent lungs." Marguerite looked down at her daughter, red-faced, dark-haired, impossibly tiny, and felt love so overwhelming it was almost painful. This was her child, hers and Luke's, a new life born in this harsh, beautiful, dangerous world. "What will you name her?" Helene asked. Marguerite looked at Luke, who had hobbled into the room on his crutches, despite the midwife's protests that father shouldn't be present immediately after birth. "What do you think?" she asked him. Luke studied the baby with wonder. "She's perfect, absolutely perfect. What about Catherine, after my mother? She died when I was young, but I remember her kindness." "Catherine," Marguerite repeated, testing the name. "Catherine Fontaine. Yes, that's right." The midwife cleaned and swaddled little Catherine, who continued to make her displeasure at the cold world known with impressive volume. But when Marguerite put her to breast for the first time, the baby quieted, beginning to nurse with surprising vigor. "She knows what she wants. Strong-willed, that one. She'll need to be, growing up in New France." After the midwife and other women departed, Luke sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his injured leg extended awkwardly, and looked at his wife and daughter with a profound contentment. "We did it," he said quietly. "We survived an ocean crossing, military politics, court-martial, dangerous patrols, pregnancy and childbirth. We're still here, still together, and now we're parents. That's remarkable." "It's survival," Marguerite corrected, though she smiled. "We've survived together. That's all we've done." "All?"
"Marguerite, look at what we've built. We started as strangers married out of necessity. Now we're a family. We have a home, however modest. We have friends, work, purpose. We've built a life worth living in the most unlikely circumstances." "Is it enough?" Marguerite asked quietly. "After everything you've sacrificed, your rank, your career advancement, nearly your life twice over, is this modest life enough for you?" Luc looked at Catherine, sleeping peacefully against Marguerite's chest, then at Marguerite herself, exhausted, disheveled, beautiful in the gray morning light. "It's everything," he said simply. "Everything that matters. I have a wife I respect, a daughter I'll protect with my life, and work that feels meaningful, even if it's not prestigious. That's more than most men achieve. It's certainly more than I expected when I was just another soldier looking for a practical wife to make military life more bearable. And instead you got me, a fille du roi who was supposed to marry a dead man but ended up with an insubordinate corporal. Best mistake I ever made, asking to meet you. Best choice I ever made, saying yes." They sat together in comfortable silence as Montreal awoke around them, soldiers reporting for morning formation, wives beginning daily routines, the garrison settling into its rhythms. Outside, December cold gripped New France, and winter would test them severely in the months ahead. But inside their modest quarters, a small family had been born, not from love at first sight or romantic destiny, but from practical choices, mutual respect, shared hardship, and the determination to build something lasting despite all obstacles. Winter with an infant proved as difficult as Marguerite had feared. Catherine was a demanding baby, hungry constantly, sleeping in short bursts, sensitive to cold and quick to cry when uncomfortable. Marguerite spent her days and nights in an exhausted haze of feeding, changing, soothing, and the endless work of keeping a baby alive in Montreal's brutal winter. Luc helped when he could, but his injured leg limited what he could do. By January, he was walking without crutches, but still unable to return to active duty. The garrison surgeon insisted he needed another month of recovery before attempting patrols. The delay frustrated Luc, who chafed at being confined to light duties while his squad went out without him. "I feel useless," he admitted one February evening, holding Catherine while Marguerite prepared their meager dinner. "You're exhausted from caring for the baby. I can barely contribute, and we're living on reduced pay because I'm still not fit for full duty." "You're recovering from a serious wound. That's not the same as being useless." "It feels the same. Every morning I watch Belmont and the others leave on patrol while I'm stuck doing administrative work. I'm a soldier, Marguerite. I'm supposed to be out there protecting people, not pushing papers in an office." "You're also a father now. That's important, too." Luc looked down at Catherine, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her tiny face peaceful. "She's so small, so fragile. How does anyone keep babies alive in this place?" "Carefully, with help, with determination." Marguerite set a pot of stew on their small table, mostly turnips and a bit of salt pork, the best they could afford on their limited budget. "And by not dwelling on how difficult everything is, we just do what needs doing one day at a time." "When did you become so wise?" "When I became responsible for keeping another human alive. You learn to be practical very quickly." In March, Luc was finally cleared for full duty. He returned to patrol work with obvious relief, though Marguerite noticed he was more cautious than before, less willing to take unnecessary risks. Fatherhood had changed him, made him more conscious of his own mortality and what his death would mean for his family. "I have people depending on me now," he explained after turning down a particularly dangerous assignment. "Before Catherine was born, if I died, you'd have been a young widow who could remarry easily. Now you'd be a widow with an infant. That makes my survival more important than my pride." "You're learning compromise," Marguerite observed. "I'm learning that principles and family obligations sometimes conflict, and family obligations should win.
That's growth, I suppose, even if it feels like surrender sometimes. April brought the icebreak on the St. Lawrence and the arrival of supply ships from France, the first connection to the wider world in 6 months. Among the supplies and new settlers came mail, including a letter addressed to Marguerite in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it with trembling fingers, afraid of what news it might bring. Madame Fontaine, I hope this letter finds you well. I am Sister Anne-Marie, who oversaw your departure from Dieppe 2 years ago. I write with sad news. Your uncle Francois passed away this winter of pneumonia. Your aunt has remarried and moved to Rouen. Before your uncle died, he gave me a small package to send to you if we could locate your direction in New France. I entrust it to the ship's captain with instructions to deliver it to you in Montreal. Your uncle spoke of regret in his final days, regret for how he treated you, for driving you to seek refuge across an ocean. He asked that I tell you he was sorry and hoped you had found happiness in the new world. May God bless you and your family. Sister Anne-Marie. Enclosed with the letter was a small leather purse containing 20 livres, more money than Marguerite had seen in months. A note in her uncle's shaking hand said simply, "For your passage. I'm sorry. F.M." Marguerite stared at the money and the note, emotions churning. Her uncle was dead. The man whose wandering hands had made her childhood miserable, who had driven her to sign up for the Filles Du Roi program just to escape his household, was gone. She should feel relief, perhaps even satisfaction. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness. He had been family, her only living relative after her parents died, and in his final days he had felt regret, had tried to make amends in the only way he could. "Bad news?" Luke asked, seeing her expression. "My uncle is dead. He left me money and an apology." She showed him the letter and the purse. 20 livres, that's substantial. What will you do with it? "Save it, for Catherine or for emergencies. We need every sou we can gather." "And the apology? Does it matter coming so late?" Marguerite thought about this. "I don't know. It doesn't undo what he did or how he made me feel, but it means he recognized his wrongdoing, even if only at the end. That's something, I suppose." "Will you forgive him?" "He's dead. Forgiveness seems irrelevant now, but I won't hate him anymore. That takes too much energy, and I need my energy for living, not for anger at someone who can't hurt me anymore." The money from her uncle allowed Marguerite to purchase better food, warmer clothing for Catherine, and supplies for her sewing work. She resumed taking commissions more seriously now that Catherine was older and slightly less demanding. The extra income made their life noticeably more comfortable, not prosperous, but no longer constantly teetering on the edge of privation. By May, their life had achieved a certain rhythm. Luke patrolled regularly, usually 3 weeks out of 4. When he was home, he helped with Catherine in household duties. When he was away, Marguerite managed alone with help from Helene and other garrison wives. It wasn't easy, but it was sustainable. Then, in late May, Captain Beauchamp summoned Luke to his office. Marguerite knew something significant had happened when Luke returned to their quarters with an expression mixing surprise, pleasure, and concern. "The captain is offering me my sergeant rank back," Luke said without preamble. "I've proven myself reliable, my wound has healed, and he says I've shown the kind of judgment that comes from maturity. He's willing to restore my rank immediately." That's wonderful. Marguerite felt genuine joy. The increased pay would make their life significantly easier, and Luke's pride would benefit from the recognition that he had earned back what he'd lost. "There's a condition," Luke continued. "The rank comes with assignment to a new position, training sergeant for the entire Montreal garrison. I would be responsible for preparing all new recruits, teaching wilderness tactics, and developing training protocols. It's prestigious work, and it would keep me in Montreal rather than on extended patrols." "That sounds perfect. Why do you look concerned?" "Because I'd be training men for situations I might not agree with. Some of the garrison's assignments are questionable, raids into disputed territory, actions that escalate tensions with native communities unnecessarily. If I train men effectively, they'll be more successful at missions I'm not sure we should be undertaking." Marguerite felt her patience fray.
Luke, you can't control how your skills are used by others. You can only control whether you do your job well and maintain your integrity in the process. If you turn down this opportunity because you're worried about theoretical misuse of your training, you'll never advance in any career. But I'd be complicit. No, you'd be competent. There's a difference. You'd be ensuring soldiers have the skills to survive, regardless of what missions they're assigned. That's valuable, and it's not the same as endorsing every policy decision the garrison makes. Luke was silent, clearly wrestling with the dilemma. Finally, he said, "What if I accept the position but reserve the right to advocate for policy changes, to use my position to argue against missions I believe are counterproductive? Through proper channels, using appropriate protocol? Yes, I've learned that lesson. I can advocate without being insubordinate. The question is whether I can live with the compromise, doing work that might indirectly support policies I disagree with. Can you live with refusing this opportunity and remaining a corporal for the rest of your service? Can you watch other, less competent men train soldiers who then die because they weren't properly prepared? That's the actual choice, Luke, not between perfect integrity and compromise, but between two imperfect options. Which can you live with?" He looked at her with something like admiration. "When did you become so good at moral reasoning?" "When I married a man whose principles required constant navigation. Someone had to provide ballast, or you'd principle yourself right off a cliff." "I love you," Luke said suddenly. "I don't think I've said that clearly enough, but I do. I love your practical wisdom, your strength, your refusal to let me indulge in self-destructive nobility. You make me better than I would be alone." Marguerite felt warmth flood through her. They had spoken of affection, of respect, of partnership, but Luke had never quite said those words so directly. "I love you too, even when you're frustratingly principled and refuse to take the easier path." "So I should accept Beauchamp's offer?" "You should accept it because it's the right choice for our family and because you can do the job with integrity, not because I'm telling you to, but because you've reasoned through the moral complications and decided you can live with the compromise involved." Luke took a deep breath. "Then I'll accept. I'll become training sergeant, and I'll do the job as well as I can while advocating for better policies through appropriate channels. And I'll trust that doing good work is valuable even when the system using that work is imperfect." He returned to Captain Beauchamp the next day and accepted the promotion. Within a week, Luke was Sergeant Fontaine again, assigned to training duties that kept him in Montreal rather than on dangerous patrols. The increased pay made their life noticeably easier. They could afford better food, warmer clothes for Catherine, and even small luxuries like proper soap and candles. More importantly, Luke seemed happier. The work suited him, teaching young soldiers, developing training protocols, using his wilderness experience to prepare men for the realities of colonial warfare. And staying in Montreal meant he was present for Catherine's daily growth, witnessing her development from helpless infant to increasingly alert baby. "She smiled at me today," Luke reported one June evening, cradling Catherine with obvious delight. "A real smile, not just gas. She recognized me and smiled." "She knows her father. That's important." "I would have missed it if I had been on patrol. I would have been gone for weeks and come home to find her changed, barely remembering me. This promotion, staying in Montreal, it lets me be a father, not just a soldier who visits occasionally." Summer brought its own rhythms. Marguerite's sewing work expanded as she gained reputation for quality alterations. Wealthy merchants' wives began seeking her services, paying rates that allowed her to save a modest amount each month. Combined with Luke's sergeant's pay, they achieved something approaching financial security. "We should think about the future," Luke said one evening as they sat together after Catherine was asleep. My term of service ends in a year. I'll receive a land grant, 40 arpents somewhere between Montreal and Quebec. We could become habitants, work our own land, build something permanent. Do you want to be a farmer? I don't know. Part of me does, the part that's tired of military life and wants to build something that's entirely mine. But part of me knows I'm a better soldier than I'd ever be a farmer, and the training position is important work that I'm good at. Could you re-enlist? Stay in the military but as a permanent posting rather than a fixed term? I could. Beauchamp has suggested it. But that means accepting that I'll always be subject to orders I might disagree with, always navigating the tension between following commands and maintaining integrity. Is that a life I want for our family? Is farming in isolation a better life? You'd go mad within 2 years, Luke. You need intellectual challenge, need to be around people, need work that engages your mind as well as your body. Farming wouldn't provide that. You're probably right, but I want Catherine to grow up with stability, not moving from garrison to garrison based on military assignments. Then we negotiate. Tell Beauchamp you'll re-enlist, but only if you can stay in Montreal permanently. Use your value as training sergeant as leverage. The worst he says is no. It was practical advice, and Luke took it. To his surprise, Beauchamp agreed readily. I was hoping you'd want to stay. Finding good training sergeants is difficult. Most men with your skills want advancement to officer ranks. You're content to remain a sergeant and focus on the training work itself. That's valuable. If you'll commit to 5 more years, I'll guarantee permanent posting in Montreal with no transfers except by your own request. 5 years is a long commitment. It's also security, guaranteed pay, permanent housing, work you excel at. That's more than most soldiers can hope for. Think about it. Luke discussed it with Marguerite that evening, laying out the terms. 5 more years in Montreal, training soldiers, drawing sergeant's pay with the possibility of eventually making master sergeant if he continued to excel. It meant abandoning the land grant. He couldn't both serve in the military and work a farm, but it meant stability and security. What does your instinct tell you?
That I want to accept, that this is the right path for us, but I worry I'm choosing security over principle, comfort over following through on the original plan to become a habitant. Those aren't principles, they're just plans. Plans can change when circumstances change. The principle is taking care of your family and doing work that matters. Accepting Beauchamp's offer does both. Then I'll accept. 5 more years in Montreal, training soldiers to survive in New France's wilderness. It's not what I expected when I first came to this colony, but it's a good life. Better than I had any right to hope for. Better than either of us had any right to hope for, Marguerite corrected. I came here expecting to marry a stranger and endure whatever life that brought. Instead, I married a principled man who drives me crazy sometimes, but who I love and respect. That's remarkably good fortune. The years that followed brought a kind of contentment neither Luke nor Marguerite had expected. Luke excelled as training sergeant, developing protocols that significantly reduced casualties among new recruits. His methods were adopted throughout New France's military structure, and his reputation grew beyond Montreal. They're calling your training manual the Fontaine method, Captain Beauchamp informed him in the spring of 1687. Quebec and Trois-Rivières are both requesting copies. You've influenced how this colony trains its soldiers, Sergeant. That's significant. It's just common sense, teaching men to think rather than just obey, preparing them for wilderness conditions rather than European-style warfare. It's revolutionary, even if you don't see it that way, and it's keeping soldiers alive. That matters more than conventional military thinking. Marguerite's sewing business continued to grow. By 1687, she employed 2 younger women who did basic work under her supervision, allowing her to focus on complex alterations and custom commissions for wealthy clients. The income had grown substantial enough that it nearly matched Luke's military pay. "You're a better businesswoman than I am a soldier," Luke observed one evening as Marguerite tallied her monthly accounts. Your enterprise is thriving while I just do what I'm told. You do what you're told in ways that save lives and improve systems. That's hardly just anything. And besides, we're partners. Your steady income provides security, while my business provides growth. Together, we're building something solid. Catherine grew from infant to toddler to young child, bright and curious, speaking both French and some Algonquin words she picked up from native women who visited the garrison. By age 4, she was helping Marguerite with simple sewing tasks, her small fingers surprisingly deft with needle and thread. She has your talent, Luke observed, watching Catherine carefully stitch a seam under Marguerite's guidance. She has determination. That's more valuable than talent. Marguerite adjusted Catherine's grip on the needle. Slower, ma chérie. Precise stitches are better than quick ones. A second child arrived in 1688, a son they named Henri after Marguerite's intended first husband, whom she never met, but whose death had led to her meeting Luke. The baby was robust and healthy, easier than Catherine had been, and Luke doted on him with obvious pride. "A son," he said wonderingly, holding the infant. "I have a son, someone to carry my name, to teach everything I know." "Don't neglect your daughter in favor of your son," Marguerite warned. "Catherine needs her father's attention too." "I won't. They're both precious. But Marguerite, I have children, real children growing up in New France, born into this world rather than the old one. That's remarkable. They'll never know France except through stories. This is their home, their only home." "As it's become ours," Marguerite agreed. "I can barely remember Dieppe anymore, or I remember it, but it feels like someone else's life, not mine. This is who I am now, Marguerite Fontaine, mother and businesswoman in Montreal, not the frightened girl who boarded the St. Francois hoping to survive an ocean crossing." Life settled into comfortable rhythms. Luke trained soldiers, coming home each evening to a household that had become genuinely happy. Marguerite ran her sewing business while raising 2 children, managing both with the practical competence she'd developed over years of frontier life. They had friends, other military families, garrison wives who had become sisters in all but blood, habitant families from nearby farms. "We've built community," Helene observed during one of her frequent visits. She and Jacques now had 3 children of their own, and the 2 families spent considerable time together. "That's what makes New France bearable, knowing you're not facing everything alone." "It's what makes it more than bearable," Marguerite corrected. "I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living, building something that will last beyond my own lifetime. That's more than I ever expected." But in 1689, news from the wider world intruded on their settled existence. Word arrived that England and France were at war, the beginning of what would be called King William's War. The conflict would inevitably spread to the colonies, pitting New France against the English colonies to the south. "This changes everything," Luke said grimly after a briefing from Captain Beauchamp. "We've been managing tensions with the Iroquois for years. Now they'll be actively allied with the English, and we'll face coordinated attacks from both native raiders and colonial forces. What does this mean for you, for your duties?" "More training, more urgency. We need to prepare for actual warfare, not just skirmishes and raids. And it means I might be called to active combat duty rather than just training. Beauchamp says all experienced soldiers will be needed if English forces attack Montreal." Marguerite felt cold fear settle in her stomach. They had been safe for 3 years, building a life free from the constant danger that had marked their early marriage. Now that safety was threatened. "You promised me 5 years in Montreal, no transfers, no dangerous assignments except by your choice." "That was before war started. Wars change everything, Marguerite. You know that." "I know, but I also know I have 2 children who need their father. You've already been wounded twice. How many times can you survive before luck runs out?" "I don't know, but I can't refuse duty because I'm afraid of dying. That's not who I am." "It is who you became when you became a father, or it should be." They argued about it that night, the first real argument they'd had in months. Luke insisted his duty to the colony superseded personal safety. Marguerite insisted his duty to his children was paramount. Neither could convince the other, and they went to bed in tense silence. The next morning, Luke came to Marguerite with a compromise. I spoke with Beauchamp. I'll continue as training sergeant, preparing men for the expanded warfare the conflict will bring, but I won't volunteer for active combat assignments unless Montreal itself is directly threatened. If English forces attack the settlement, I'll fight. I have no choice about that, but I won't seek out danger unnecessarily. Will that satisfy you? It wasn't everything Marguerite wanted, but it was more than she'd feared she would get. It satisfies me. Thank you for considering our family's needs alongside military duty. I'm learning balance, slowly with your help, but learning. I can serve the colony without sacrificing unnecessarily. That's maturity, I suppose. The war brought changes to Montreal. The garrison expanded, new fortifications were constructed, and tension pervaded daily life. Marguerite noticed more soldiers in the streets, more weapons being produced and stockpiled, more worried conversations among the wives about possible attacks. But life continued. Children needed to be fed and clothed, businesses needed to operate, communities needed to maintain themselves despite the threat of violence. Marguerite focused on these daily necessities, refusing to let fear dominate her existence. If I spend my life worrying about what might happen, I'll miss what is happening, she told Helene during one of their sewing sessions, with their combined 5 children playing nearby. Catherine is learning to read. Henri is taking his first steps. My business is thriving. These are real, immediate joys. I won't surrender them to anxiety about future dangers I can't control. You've become wise, Helene observed. I've become practical. Wisdom is too grand a word. I've just learned what many women in New France learn. You survive by focusing on what you can control and accepting what you cannot. In the fall of 1689, the war arrived in force. An English raid struck Lachine, just upriver from Montreal, killing dozens of habitants and destroying buildings. The brutality shocked the colony. Women and children killed or captured, farms burned, a message that New France was vulnerable despite its fortifications. Luke was among the soldiers who responded, pursuing the raiders into the wilderness. Marguerite spent 3 agonizing days not knowing if he was alive or dead, caring for their children while terror gnawed at her constantly. When he finally returned, exhausted and grim-faced, she held him tightly without speaking. Some fears were too deep for words. "I'm all right," he said finally. "We pursued them but couldn't catch them. They knew the territory too well, moved too fast. All we could do was recover bodies and survivors." "How many dead?" 24 habitants, mostly women and children. The men were in the fields when the attack came. They didn't have time to protect their families. Luke's voice was hollow. "I've seen combat, Marguerite. I've seen soldiers die, but this was different. These weren't combatants. They were farmers and their families slaughtered in their own homes." "Will it happen here? Could Montreal be raided like that?" "We're better fortified, more soldiers, better defenses, but yes, it could happen. We're vulnerable, just like every settlement in New France. The war has made that brutally clear." That night, lying in the darkness with their children asleep nearby, Marguerite asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Should we leave? Go back to France, where it's safer?" Luke was quiet for a long moment. "Is it safer? France has its own wars, its own dangers, and we've built a life here, friends, work, community. Starting over in France would mean abandoning everything we've created. But we'd be alive to start over. We're alive now, and we're living meaningful lives, not just surviving. That's worth some risk, isn't it?" Marguerite thought of the frightened girl who had boarded the Saint-François 7 years ago, desperate to escape her uncle's household, willing to accept any hardship for a chance at a different life. She had found that different life, had built it through determination and compromise and partnership with a man she had learned to love. Was she willing to abandon it now because danger had increased? Or would she do what she had always done, adapt, persist, survive. We stay, she decided. We stay and we build and we trust that we're strong enough to weather whatever comes. We've survived this much. We can survive more. Together, Luke added. Always together. They held each other in the darkness, listening to their children's soft breathing, grateful for one more day in the life they had built against all odds in this harsh, beautiful, dangerous world. The king's bride from Dieppe had become a mother, a businesswoman, a survivor who had found not just survival, but genuine happiness in New France, and she would fight to keep it, whatever the cost. The winter of 1689-1690 passed in tense anticipation. Montreal strengthened its defenses, stockpiled supplies, and prepared for attacks that might come with the spring thaw. Luke worked 18-hour days training soldiers in defensive tactics, while Marguerite organized the garrison wives into support networks, planning for medical care, food distribution, and evacuation procedures if the settlement came under attack. "We're preparing for war on our doorstep," Marguerite said to Helene as they inventoried medical supplies one February afternoon. "This isn't raids or skirmishes anymore. This is organized warfare, and we're in the middle of it. At least we're preparing together. Every wife knows her role. Every family has a plan. That's better than panic when crisis comes." If crisis comes. When, Helene corrected. We both know it's when, not if. The English colonies want New France eliminated. They'll keep attacking until they succeed, or we find a way to push them back permanently. The attack came in March, but not from the direction anyone expected. A combined force of English colonial militia and their Iroquois allies struck from the south, bypassing Montreal's main defenses to hit a fortified farm settlement called Saint-Sulpice, where 30 families lived under the protection of a small garrison outpost. Word reached Montreal at dawn. The settlement was under attack, the small garrison overwhelmed, habitants trapped in their fortified church while attackers attempted to burn them out. Captain Beauchamp mobilized every available soldier, including Luke. Within an hour, a relief force of 60 men were marching towards Saint-Sulpice, 15 miles south. Marguerite watched them go with Catherine clinging to her skirt and Henri in her arms. She had learned not to beg Luke to stay safe, not to make him carry her fear along with his military duties, but watching him march toward danger never became easier. "Papa will come back," Catherine said with the certainty of a child who didn't understand mortality. "Yes," Marguerite agreed, praying it was true. "Papa always comes back." The relief force returned 30 hours later, bringing survivors from Saint-Sulpice, 16 habitants, mostly women and children, along with the 3 surviving soldiers from the outpost garrison. The rest were dead or captured. Luke came directly to their quarters, still in his blood-stained uniform, his face gray with exhaustion and something darker, the haunted look of someone who had seen horrors. "Go to Helen's quarters," he told Marguerite quietly. "Take the children. I need time alone." "Luke, what happened?" "Please, just go. I can't be around the children right now. Not until I've..." Tyloft, his hands shaking. Marguerite had never seen him like this. She gathered Catherine and Henri quickly and took them to Helene's quarters, then returned to find Luke sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, staring at nothing. She sat beside him silently, not touching, just present. Finally, he spoke. "We were too late. By the time we arrived, they'd burned most of the settlement. The habitants who survived had barricaded themselves in the church. The attackers were trying to burn it down with them inside when we arrived." "But you saved them. 16 people survived because you got there. 14 died because we didn't get there sooner. And the manner of their deaths..." Luke's voice broke. "I won't describe it. I can't. Just know that I've seen what humans are capable of doing to each other, and I don't know how to unsee it." Marguerite took his hand, holding it tightly.
You did your duty. You saved who you could save. That's all anyone can do. Is it enough? Is saving 16 people when 14 died enough to justify? He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything: the military, the war, the choices that had brought them to this point. I don't know, but I know you can't carry the weight of every death, every tragedy. You'll break under it. You have to focus on what you saved, not what you lost. How do you do that? How do you compartmentalize horror and just keep functioning? The same way every woman in New France does when faced with impossible situations. One moment at a time, one task at a time, never looking too far ahead or dwelling too long on what's behind. Survival, Luke. It's just survival. He leaned against her, and she felt him shaking. I thought I'd seen the worst of this life, but today showed me I was wrong. There's always something worse waiting. Then we face it together, just as we faced everything else. They sat together on the floor of their modest quarters while Montreal continued around them, and Marguerite held the man she loved while he processed trauma she could only imagine. This was marriage in New France, not just shared joy and partnership, but shared grief and the burden of surviving in a world that seemed determined to break everyone eventually. But they weren't broken. Battered, certainly, scarred, but not broken. And that would have to be enough. In the days that followed the Saint-Sulpice attack, Montreal transformed into a fortress city. Civilians were trained in basic defense. Every adult knew emergency routes and evacuation procedures. The garrison drilled constantly, preparing for the assault everyone knew was coming. It arrived in early April. A force of 200 English colonial militia and Iroquois warriors attacked Montreal directly, attempting to overwhelm the defenses through sheer numbers. The battle lasted 3 days. Marguerite spent them in the garrison's central fortification with the other wives and children, listening to musket fire and cannon blasts, tending wounded soldiers brought in from the walls, and trying to keep Catherine and Henri calm despite the terror surrounding them. Luc fought on the western wall, where the attack was most concentrated. Marguerite didn't see him for the entire 3 days, had no way of knowing if he was alive or dead until a messenger brought word that the attack had been repulsed and casualties were being assessed. She waited with the other wives in the medical area, watching wounded men being brought in, searching every blood-stained face for her husband. Some wives found their husbands among the wounded. Others found them among the dead, laid out in rows under canvas. Marguerite counted 14 bodies, then stopped counting. Finally, Luc appeared, exhausted, wounded in the shoulder, but walking, alive. She ran to him, not caring about propriety or dignity, and held him as tightly as she could without aggravating his wound. "You're alive! Thank God you're alive!" "Barely. The ball grazed my shoulder. Painful, but not serious. I'm lucky. Many of the men I trained," he gestured toward the rows of bodies, "they did everything right and still died. Sometimes training isn't enough." "But you survived. We all survived. Montreal held." "For now. They'll be back. This wasn't a final assault, just a test of our defenses. They'll analyze what worked, plan better, come back stronger. This war is far from over." He was right. The attacks continued through 1690 and into 1691, raids on outlying farms, skirmishes in the forest, occasional direct assaults on fortified settlements. Montreal held, but the constant state of siege took its toll. Food grew scarce, supplies from France arrived irregularly, people died from disease, malnutrition, and violence. But life continued despite everything. Children were born, businesses operated, communities maintained themselves through sheer stubborn determination. Marguerite kept her sewing operation running, though she often accepted payment in food rather than coin when clients couldn't afford cash.
Luc continued training soldiers, preparing them for a war that seemed to have no end. And through it all, they held their family together, sometimes through grace, sometimes through grim determination, but always together. In the spring of 1692, word finally arrived that peace negotiations had begun in Europe. The fighting in New France didn't stop immediately. Wars in colonies always outlasted their European counterparts, but the intensity decreased. Raids became less frequent. The constant state of alert began to ease. "It might actually be over," Helene said one May afternoon as they sat together watching their children play in the garrison courtyard. "After 3 years of terror, we might actually return to something like normal life. I don't remember what normal feels like anymore, but I'm willing to relearn it." By summer, the fighting had largely ceased. Official peace wouldn't be declared until the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, but the immediate danger had passed. Montreal began rebuilding, expanding, returning to growth after 3 years of merely surviving. Luc, now 36 and a master sergeant, continued his training work with renewed purpose. "We prepare for the next war while hoping it never comes," he explained to his students. "That's the paradox of military service, training men to fight while praying they never have to use that training." Marguerite, now 30, had become one of Montreal's most successful businesswomen. Her sewing operation employed 5 women and provided steady income. She had saved enough money to purchase their quarters from the garrison, a rare privilege that gave them true ownership rather than just military housing. Catherine was 8, already showing signs of the determination that characterized both her parents. Henry was 4, boisterous and affectionate, adoring his older sister and worshiping his father. They were children of New France in the fullest sense, knowing no other home, shaped by frontier hardships, but also by the sense of possibility that defined colonial life. "We've built something remarkable," Luc said one evening in the fall of 1692, sitting with Marguerite on the small porch they'd added to their home. "Against all odds, through wars and wounds and constant danger, we've built a family and a life worth living. That's an achievement." "We've survived," Marguerite corrected. "That's all. We survived together when everything tried to break us apart." "That's more than survival. Survival is just staying alive. We've thrived. We've created beauty and meaning in a harsh world. Our children are happy. We're happy. That's remarkable." Marguerite thought about the girl who had boarded the Saint François 11 years ago, terrified and alone, sailing towards an uncertain future with a man she would never meet. She thought about the choices that followed, accepting Luc's proposal, standing by him through his principles and his wounds, building a business, raising children, weathering a war. Every choice had been difficult. Every choice had cost something, but every choice had also brought her here, to this porch, with this man, with these children, with this life she had built through determination and compromise and love. "It is remarkable," she agreed, "and we earned every bit of it." They sat together as evening fell over Montreal, watching the settlement settle into peaceful rhythms after years of violence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. This was New France, and challenges were constant. But they would face those challenges as they had faced everything else, together, with the strength born of shared hardship and the knowledge that whatever came, they could survive it. The King's bride from Dieppe had found her place in the world, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything she had crossed an ocean hoping to find, and more than she had dared to dream possible. The end. Historical note. The Filles Du Roi program sent approximately 800 young women from France to New France between 1663 and 1673, but marriages and immigration continued in smaller numbers throughout the colonial period. These women were essential to establishing permanent French settlement in the colony, and their descendants today number in the millions. King William's War, 1688 to 1697, was the first of the French and Indian Wars, bringing sustained conflict between New France and the English colonies. The Lachine Massacre of 1689 was a real and brutal event that shocked the colony. Montreal withstood several attacks during this period, and garrison life was dangerous for both soldiers and their families. Military discipline in New France was often more flexible than European armies, adapting to frontier conditions. Soldiers who questioned conventional tactics were sometimes valued for their independent thinking, though tension with more traditional officers was common. Many soldiers did re-enlist after their initial terms, receiving land grants or continuing in military service. Women in New France did operate businesses, often achieving more economic independence than their European counterparts. Widows and wives regularly ran shops, trading operations, and craft businesses that supported or even exceeded their husband's military or agricultural income. The life on the colonial frontier was harsh, violent, and uncertain, but it also offered opportunities for reinvention and advancement that would have been impossible in France's rigid social structure. For those brave enough to endure its hardships, New France represented genuine possibility.